Walter Crowe snatched the plate from the counter and flung it across the trading post kitchen without warning. The biscuits hit the far wall and scattered across the floor, 6 of them, still warm, still perfect, while every man in the room went quiet. "You call this food?" Walter's voice was the kind that carried through walls. "My dog wouldn't eat this slop." Elena Voss stood at the stove with flour on her hands and said nothing. She'd learned a long time ago that saying something cost you more than staying silent. She just looked at the mess on the floor. "And don't think about cleaning it up on my time," Walter added, already turning away. "Take it from her wages, boys." Again, the men at the tables looked at their own plates, the same biscuits, the ones they'd been eating in appreciative silence 2 minutes before, and not one of them said a word. That was Black Hollow Pass in the winter of 1879. That was Elena's life. If you've ever swallowed something that wasn't yours to swallow, a humiliation, a lie told about you so loudly that you started to believe it, then you already know exactly how she felt. If you've ever wondered what it would take to finally stop swallowing it, then this story is for you. Stay with us all the way to the end of Elena's story, because what happens in those later parts is the kind of thing that changes how you see a person, maybe even how you see yourself. Subscribe to this channel if you haven't yet, so you don't miss the stories we put out every week. Hit the like button and drop a comment telling us what city or country you're watching from. I genuinely love seeing how far these stories travel. Now let's go back to Black Hollow Pass, and to the woman that nobody in that frozen little town thought was worth a second look. The trading post sat at the edge of a pass that most people only moved through. Nobody came to Black Hollow to stay. It was a stop, a place to resupply before the real journey continued. And Walter Crowe had built his operation around that fact, with the efficiency of a man who understood that captive customers don't need to be impressed. He'd hired Elena 3 years earlier when his previous cook had left without notice, and he'd needed someone immediately. Elena had been 19 then, recently arrived from the Eastern Valleys with a small bag and no particular plan, and she'd walked in the right door at the right moment. Walter had looked her over, the heavy body, the plain face, the quiet way she held herself, and decided she would work for less than anyone else he could find, because she didn't have many other options. He'd been right about the options. He'd been wrong about everything else. Elena had learned to cook from her grandmother, who had learned from hers, and the knowledge moved through her hands the way muscle memory does, without her having to think much about it. She understood fire. She understood how flour behaved in cold, dry air versus damp cold. She understood that altitude changed how bread rose, and that the particular water in Black Hollow Pass, which came down from snowmelt through limestone, gave things a particular clean taste that you had to lean into rather than fight. None of this translated into the kind of respect that mattered in practical terms. What translated into practical terms was that Elena was large. Larger than the women in the catalogs. Larger than the women the men at the trading post thought about when they thought about women. She moved with a certain deliberateness that some people called slow, though if any of those people had worked from 4 in the morning until midnight the way she did, they might have called it efficient. She didn't waste steps. She couldn't afford to. The morning after Walter threw the biscuits a Monday, cold enough that the water in the basin near the door had a crust of ice on it by the time she rose. Elena started the stoves before anyone else was awake and stood in the quiet kitchen, letting the warmth build around her. She had a habit of doing her best thinking in that window before the day fully started, before the voices came. She thought about the biscuits. They had been good. She knew they'd been good because she'd watched 3 of the regular freight men eat 4 apiece without slowing down. She knew they'd been good because Holt, the young man who drove supplies up from the valley twice a month, had actually thanked her when he thought Walter wasn't listening, which told her something about what Holt thought of the relative cost of gratitude in that place. She knew they'd been good because she'd made them. The problem was not the biscuits. The problem was that Walter had needed to make a point to someone in the room. She was never entirely sure which man triggered these episodes, only that they came in cycles, and she was the point he made. The plate thrown, the wages docked, the reminder that she held her position at his discretion. She cracked eggs into a bowl and watched the yolks settle, and didn't think about leaving because leaving required somewhere to go. And she'd spent 3 years building a reason to stay in Black Hollow Pass that had nothing to do with Walter Crowe. She had a system. She had a garden, or the remains of one in the frozen ground that she'd planted in the side yard. She had relationships with the trappers who came through, who always left a little extra dried meat at her door in exchange for her keeping aside the heel of every bread loaf they didn't know about. She had a small amount of money, very small, given what Walter regularly deducted from her wages soon into the lining of her second coat. She had in her private accounting a life, small and cold and sometimes humiliating, but hers. By the time Walter came down at 7:30, the dining room smelled like coffee and smoked meat, and the kind of warmth that makes a person feel more human than they did 5 minutes before. He sat at his regular table without commenting on it. He never commented on what was good. He moved through the goodness like it was simply the absence of something bad, which it was in his framework. Elena didn't exist in positive terms for Walter. She existed in the gap between acceptable and unacceptable. "We've got a cattle outfit coming through this evening," he said, not looking up from the papers he'd brought down with him. "Big one, 20, maybe 30 men," Elena calculated quickly. "Flour on hand, yes. Salt pork, yes. Dried beans she'd been soaking since last night, yes. She'd need to kill 2 more of the chickens and start the pot by noon at the latest." "What time?" she asked. "When they get here?" Walter turned a page. "Try not to embarrass yourself." The cattle outfit arrived at 6 in the evening, with the sun dropping hard behind the western ridge, and the temperature falling with it. Elena heard them before she saw them boots on the porch boards, the low sounds of men who'd been outdoors for weeks and were too tired to be loud about it. She'd been cooking since noon. The dining room could seat 20 if people were willing to sit close, which tired cattlemen generally were. The extra men ate outside on the porch with their plates on their laps, which she'd seen plenty of times and accounted for when portioning. She had a system for feeding large groups that involved keeping things moving from the kitchen in waves rather than trying to serve everyone at once. It was more work for her, but it meant the food stayed hotter and she could monitor what was running low before it became a problem. She was on her 3rd trip to the dining room with a fresh pan of biscuits when she noticed the man in the corner. He wasn't making any noise, which was partly why she'd missed him on the first 2 passes. He was sitting at the small table in the corner near the window, which was the worst table in the room, drafty in winter, bright in summer, wobbly on the uneven floor, and he was eating alone, which the other men seemed to accept without much question, which meant he was someone they took directions from. He'd taken his coat off, which not everyone had done yet. Dark hair, some gray coming in at the temples, somewhere in his early 40s, with the kind of face that had spent a long time outdoors and looked it. Not soft anywhere. He ate carefully, which was unusual. Most men at the end of a long drive ate the way Elena imagined they did everything else when they were tired, which was fast and without much consideration. He took a bite of the biscuit and stopped. She noticed because she was watching, and she watched because she'd learned that reading a room told you things you couldn't get any other way. How much more food you needed, where a fight might be starting to build, when someone was sick enough that you should probably offer them something plain. She was watching the room when the man in the corner took a bite and went still. Not the stillness of someone who'd found something wrong. The other kind. He looked down at the biscuit like he was trying to figure out what it had done to him. Elena set the pan on the warming station at the side of the room and went back to the kitchen. She had 6 pies still to slice and a pot of beans that needed one more check and nothing else to think about. He was there the next morning. That was the thing that registered before she'd even fully come awake to the day. She heard a voice in the dining room that wasn't one of the regular voices, and she recognized it without being able to explain how. The way you sometimes can, with a voice that had made an impression even without words. The cattle outfit was moving out before first light. She could hear the sounds of departure, the low talk and the horses, and the particular way a large group of men moves when it's trying to be quiet. But one man was still at a table inside, and when she came through from the kitchen with the coffee pot, it was the man from the corner. He looked up when she came in. "I'd like to ask you something," he said, which was not what she'd expected. "If you have a minute." She didn't. Particularly, she had the morning round to do and the supply inventory and a barrel of salt that had developed a problem she'd been putting off looking at. "Sure," she said. "Those biscuits last night." He paused like he was choosing words carefully, which people didn't usually do with her. "What did you put in them?" Elena set the coffee pot down on the nearest table. "Flour, lard, salt, a little soda. The water here is cold. Cold water helps the fat stay in layers." He nodded slowly. "Where'd you learn that, my grandmother?" "She from around here?" "No. Eastern Valleys originally." She picked up the coffee pot again. "You want more?" He held out his cup. "Caleb Thornton," he said. She poured. "I know who you are." She didn't, in the sense of having met him before, but she'd heard the name from the freight men. The Thornton outfit was big enough that it came up in conversation when people were talking about land, which was most of what people talked about in this part of the territory. Elena Voss. He looked at her the way the man from the corner had looked at the biscuit, which was not the way men usually looked at her. There was something assessing about it that wasn't unkind-like. He was arriving at a conclusion he hadn't started with. "You been cooking here long?" he asked. 3 years. "You like it?" She considered telling him the truth and decided it would take too long. "It's work," she said, which was true and not exactly an answer. Walter came down the stairs at that moment in the particular way he did when he'd heard voices and wanted to know who was talking to who. He saw Thornton and his entire posture changed. Not dramatically, just enough that if you were watching, which Elena was, you saw the small recalibration, the invisible straightening that happened when Walter recognized someone worth impressing. "Mr. Thornton," Walter said, moving toward him with one hand already extended. "I hope we took good care of your outfit last night."
You did?
Thornton didn't stand for the handshake, just reached up briefly and set the cup down. "Your cook knows what she's doing." Walter laughed, which was a sound Elena had learned to interpret in all its variations. This one was the dismissive laugh, the one that redirected credit toward something more acceptable. "We do what we can up here. It's a tough posting." "I'd imagine it is." Thornton glanced at Elena, who had moved toward the kitchen doorway. "You should give her a raise." The laugh that followed was different, shorter, with an edge under it. "She does fine." Elena went through the kitchen door, before either of them could look to see what her face was doing. Caleb Thornton left with his outfit that morning, and Elena filed him away in the category of people who'd passed through, which was the only category that mattered in a place where everyone passed through. She went back to the barrel of salt. The problem with the barrel was that moisture had gotten in at some point, and the top 2 inches had solidified into a crust that was rendering the salt below it inaccessible without significant work. She'd found a similar problem with a barrel of sugar 2 years ago, and had lost the better part of 40 pounds of it before she understood what was happening. She wasn't going to lose the salt. She worked at it with a chisel and a determination that was not particularly graceful to watch, and by mid-morning she'd saved about 80% of it, which she considered acceptable. Holt came in around noon with the twice-monthly supply run and found her reorganizing what she'd saved into a smaller sealed container. "Heard you fed the Thornton outfit last night," he said, setting a crate down on the work table. "We fed them, yes. Big operation." Holt was young enough that he still thought talking about things he'd heard was interesting in itself, without needing to arrive at a point. "Thornton's got the biggest spread north of the canyon. About 8,000 acres last I heard. Runs cattle, mostly some horses." Elena checked the inventory list she kept on a piece of board near the window. "He's looking for a head cook, I think. Or that's what people are saying." Holt shifted the crate. His last one left in October. Married someone, moved east. He's had one of his ranch hands doing it since then, which, from what those boys were saying last night, has not gone well. Elena marked flour on the list. "Probably pay well," Holt said. "Outfit that size, he'd need someone who could really—" "I'm not looking for a position," Elena said. Holt nodded and let it go, because he was 22 and smart enough to know when he'd reached the edge of what was his business. 2 weeks passed before Caleb Thornton came back through. He arrived alone this time in the early afternoon, and tied his horse at the post outside with the manner of someone who'd calculated that this was a reasonable stop, that he had a specific errand, and that the errand wouldn't take long. He came into the trading post. Walter was in the back doing inventory, which Elena knew because she'd heard him moving crates for the past hour. She was in the kitchen, prepping for the evening meal, and she heard the front door, heard the boots on the floorboards moving toward the kitchen, which wasn't where customers went. She was still turned toward the stove when he appeared in the doorway. "Miss Voss," he said. She turned around. "Mr. Thornton." He didn't come further into the kitchen, which she noticed. He stood at the threshold like he understood it was her territory and he was requesting entry. "I want to offer you a position," he said. "Head cook at my ranch. Your own cabin, separate from the main house. $30 a month." Elena had been making $6 a month from Walter, with the deductions pulling it lower than that on a regular basis. She said nothing for a moment. "You'd have complete control over the kitchen," Caleb continued. "I've got 23 men to feed, and 2 of them are getting tired of beans every night. I need someone who can manage supplies, plan meals through winter, and run things without me having to be involved." Lena wiped her hands on her apron. "Why me?" she asked. It was not the question most people would have asked. Most people hearing that offer would have started calculating. But she genuinely wanted to know, because she'd spent 3 years in a place where the answer to that question, when she applied it to her own situation, had never been flattering. Caleb thought about it for a moment, which she appreciated. He could have said the easy thing, "You're talented." "I was impressed. It's obvious," but he didn't reach for that. "Because you know things about food that most people don't know how to know," he said finally. "And because you saved 80% of that salt barrel instead of throwing the whole thing out." She looked at him. "You saw that?" "I was coming back for something I'd left in the dining room." A small movement at the corner of his mouth. I didn't want to interrupt. Elena turned back to the stove and moved the pot that was starting to bubble too fast. She needed to think, and she thought better when her hands were doing something. $30 a month. Her own cabin. Complete control over the kitchen. And then the other side of the ledger, which she knew the shape, of even if she'd never quite put it into words. She was 37 years old, and she had arranged her life in this cold, drafty place around routines she could control, because the world outside those routines had not historically been kind to her. She had a body that people looked at and made decisions about. She had a way of moving through the world careful, deliberate, not asking for more than she thought she could get, that worked in a place she knew. "I'd like a day to think on it," she said. "That's fair," Caleb said. He left. She burned the edges of dinner that night. Not badly, not in a way that anyone complained about, just the small kind of scorching that happens when your attention is somewhere else. And she stood in the kitchen after the meal was done and looked at the marks on the bottom of the pan and understood that this was going to require a decision she actually made, which was different from the decisions that had gotten made for her over the years by circumstance and other people's choices. Walter found out by accident. She hadn't told him, which was perhaps a small failing of courage on her part, but she'd wanted to decide first and then tell him after the deciding. And in the compressed space of the next morning, the order of events got away from her. Holt was the one who told him, not maliciously. Holt was not a malicious person. He'd just heard from one of Thornton's freight contacts that Thornton had made the offer, and he mentioned it to Walter in passing while they were doing the supply inventory, not understanding that Walter didn't know. Elena was in the kitchen and heard the change in Walter's voice through the wall. He came in the way he came in when he was going to make something clear, which was with a particular economy of movement that meant he'd already decided on his outcome, and the rest was just communication. "Thornton offered you a position," he said. Elena was slicing dried meat. She kept slicing. "He did. And you're thinking about taking it." "I'm thinking about it." Walter moved to the center of the kitchen, which was his way of making himself larger in a room. "You've got obligations here," she turned then. "What obligations?" "You've been here 3 years. I've invested in you. You've paid me $6 a month when I was worth 3 times that. And you've docked it when you were annoyed." She heard her own voice, flat and specific. "That's not investment. That's what you call it when someone doesn't have other options." Walter's face did several things in quick succession. She watched them happen. "You're not young," he said. "You're not—" He stopped. "Not what?" He chose a different word than the one he'd started toward. "Not likely to find a situation that accommodates you the way I have. Thornton doesn't know what he's getting into." Elena put down the knife. She had a moment. She recognized it as a moment, the kind she usually talked herself through by cataloging the practical reasons for staying small, where she could have said something that would cost her. She chose not to, because the choice she was making didn't actually require his failure to be part of it. "I'll finish through the end of the week," she said. "You'll have time to find someone. If you leave, you won't have a reference." "I know." She picked up the knife again. "Your freight contacts can tell anyone who asks what the food here was like." Walter stood there for another moment in the geometry of someone who expected a different result. Then he left. Elena went back to the slicing. The meat was good, better than what most stations got this far north, because she'd cultivated a relationship with one of the trappers who brought down the best cuts first. She thought about that, about the small supply network she'd built for herself in this place. Over 3 years, the winter garden, the trappers, the knowledge she'd accumulated about altitude and water and cold and preservation, all of it would go with her. That she understood was the thing Walter had never quite grasped. What he'd invested in was not her loyalty. What he'd paid, irregularly and resentfully, was for the use of knowledge that lived in her hands and her memory, and her ability to read a pantry and know what it needed. He could hire someone else. He could not hire what she knew. She finished the meat and moved to the bread. The last 3 days were not comfortable. Walter moved through the spaces she occupied with a cold deliberateness that communicated his displeasure without requiring him to say anything else. And the regular men at the trading post had mostly heard by then, which split them into 2 camps, the ones who said nothing and the ones who said things that were meant to sound like advice, but were actually small versions of the argument Walter had already tried. "You sure about this?" "Big outfit, lot of men. Different from what you're used to. Ranches are rough. It's not like trading post work. Thornton's a good man, I'm not saying he isn't, but you'd be dependent on one employer instead of a posting with options." She listened to all of it with the same expression she'd developed over years of listening to things that required a response that cost nothing. She thanked people for their concern. She went back to her work. The night before her last day, she was in the kitchen later than usual, going through the inventory one final time. Not because it was required, not because Walter had asked for it, but because she had left everything she'd ever tended in better shape than she found it, and she wasn't going to change that now. She heard the door behind her and turned. It was Holt. He was holding his hat in both hands the way young men do when they're uncomfortable. "I didn't mean to tell him," he said. "I didn't know he didn't know." "I know you didn't," Elena said. I wasn't trying to cause you trouble." "You didn't cause it, Holt." It was already there. She moved a jar back into its place on the shelf. What happens with Walter and me was going to happen one way or another. It just needed a door. He stood there a moment. You're not angry? She thought about it honestly, which she tried to do. At you? No, at him. She was quiet for a moment. I don't have the energy for anger at Walter anymore, she said finally. That's probably the truest thing I know about where I am right now. Holt nodded. He turned his hat over. He was 22 and had the kind of uncomplicated decency that some people grew out of and some didn't, and she hoped for his sake he was the kind that didn't. Good luck, said. Thank you, Holt. He left. She finished the inventory. She arrived at Thornton Ranch on a Wednesday in late November with 2 bags, a small crate of things she'd accumulated over 3 years that were hers, and hands that had spent the 3-day journey unconsciously flexing in the cold, thinking about kitchens. The ranch was bigger than she'd imagined, which she hadn't let herself do much of. The main house sat up on a low rise with the outbuildings spreading out below it, and there was a logic to the layout that told her something about whoever had planned it. Things were where they needed to be, not where they looked best from a certain angle. Caleb met her at the edge of the yard. He'd ridden out to meet her wagon, which she hadn't expected. Welcome, he said. I'll show you the kitchen first. That would be appreciated. The kitchen was larger than the one at the trading post, better stocked in some ways, worse in others. She could see immediately that someone had been making do. The organization had the particular scrambled quality of a space where whoever was cooking understood neither the space nor the cooking, just the sequence of tasks. Caleb watched her take it in. I know it needs work, he said. Most things do. She set her bag down. I'll need to understand the supply situation. What comes in, when, from where, and what's reliable versus what I shouldn't count on. I can have that for you by tomorrow, and I'll need to know the men's preferences by the end of the first week. Anything they can't eat for physical reasons I need to know about right away. 2 men can't have onion, Caleb said. One has trouble with some grains, haven't quite figured out which ones. She filed it. I'll figure it out. He showed her to the cabin, which was small and clean, and had a wood stove and a real lock on the door. And when he left, she stood in the middle of it for a long moment in the quiet. She had a window that looked out over the yard. She could see one of the ranch hands crossing from the barn to the bunkhouse, moving fast in the cold. He didn't look up. Nobody was watching her. Nobody was waiting for her to get something wrong. She sat down on the edge of the bed, which was the first time she'd sat down for a reason other than exhaustion in longer than she could remember. Then she got up, because there was a kitchen she needed to understand before morning. The first meal she cooked for Thornton Ranch was supper on the night she arrived. Beans, which were already soaking, and cornbread, which she made with the last of the butter she found in the cold box, and a hand she'd developed for getting the crust exactly to the edge of where burnt began without going over. She didn't know 23 strangers yet. She knew beans and cornbread. The men came in from the cold and sat and ate, and she stayed in the kitchen and listened to the sounds of the dining room, which told her things words didn't. The pace of eating, where it slowed. Whether the sounds of conversation picked up once they'd had a few bites, which usually meant they were warm and satisfied. Whether the plates came back clean, everything came back clean. One of the ranch hands' broad-shouldered man, maybe 50, with a scar that ran from his left ear to his jaw, appeared in the kitchen doorway. Ma'am, he said. That cornbread. She waited. That was better than what we've been having, he said, which was clearly the best compliment he'd decided was appropriate for a first night. Thank you, she said. What's your name, Rucker? Rucker. I'll figure out what you prefer. Give me a week. He looked at her for a moment with the same kind of assessing non-judgment that Caleb had, which she was starting to understand might be a characteristic of people who worked land rather than traded on it. Yes, ma'am, he said, and went back to the table. Elena stood in the kitchen with the last of the dishes to wash, with the cold coming in under the door and the fire in the stove doing its reliable work, and she thought about what she had taken on. 23 men, winter coming, a kitchen that needed reorganizing from the ground up, a situation that would require her to perform at a level she'd been performing for 3 years without anyone fully seeing it, except now someone was actually expecting it. She turned to the dishes. She'd been doing this since 4 in the morning, since she was 16 years old. She was not afraid of expectation. What she was, standing alone in that kitchen at the end of a day that had changed the architecture of her life, was something she needed a moment to identify. She stood with her hands in the water and let herself feel it. It was something close to possible. Not happy. She wasn't the kind of person who arrived at a new place and felt happy. That had never been her mechanism. But possible. Like the shape of what might happen next had more room in it than the shape of what had come before. She finished the dishes. She banked the fire. She went to the cabin, locked the door, and lay down in the dark and listened to the wind coming off the pass, which was not so different from the wind she'd been listening to for 3 years. Except that on this side of it, nobody was keeping count of what she owed. The first week at Thornton Ranch was not graceful. Elena had known it wouldn't be. New kitchens never were. There was always a period of learning the particular stubbornness of a space, which burner ran too hot, which door on the cold box didn't seal properly at the bottom, where the drafts came from, and at what time of day they mattered. She moved through the learning without complaint, because complaining about it wouldn't make the burner behave differently, and she'd found over many years that accepting the actual shape of a problem was faster than arguing with the shape you'd expected. The cold box seal she fixed on the second day with a strip of leather she found in the supply barn. The burner she learned to use for low, slow work rather than fighting its tendency. The drafts she traced back to a gap in the wall behind the flour bin that someone had filled with cloth years ago and then left when the cloth rotted, and she replaced it with a cut of board that Rucker helped her nail in on the third morning, without either of them making a significant event of it. The men were the harder red. 23 of them, and they came at her sideways in the first days. Not hostile exactly. Not the open dismissiveness she'd navigated at the trading post, but something more like suspension. They were waiting to see what kind of thing she would be before they committed to an attitude. A few of the younger ones watched her move through the kitchen with expressions she'd seen plenty of times and had learned not to dignify, because the moment you acknowledged that kind of watching it became a negotiation, and she hadn't come here to negotiate her right to do her work. Rucker was the first one to settle. She'd identified him early as someone whose opinion the others calibrated against. Not a foreman, not officially, but the kind of man whose approval was the actual currency in a bunkhouse, the one whose quiet nod after he'd tasted something made 3 other men relax without knowing why. She made his eggs the way he'd mentioned he liked them on the second morning, offhandedly, in a sentence that hadn't been directed at her specifically. He'd said something to one of the other hands about his grandmother making them a certain way, with the whites firm at the edge and the yolk still soft, which was technically straightforward but easy to miss if you were cooking for 20 and not paying attention to who was talking in the corner. She paid attention. Rucker sat down to breakfast on the third day and looked at his plate, and then up at her in a way that was worth more than most compliments she'd received in her life. "You were listening to that," he said. "It's my job to listen," she said, and went back to the kitchen. She heard him say something to the man next to him that she couldn't fully catch, but the tone of it carried. The shift in the room was not dramatic. It was the kind of shift that happens when the person who sets the temperature of a space changes their mind about something. Nobody announces it, it just becomes the weather. The harder problem arrived on the 4th day in the form of a man named Dix. Dix was young mid-20s, probably, with the kind of confidence that comes from being good-looking and physically capable and having spent his whole life in environments that rewarded those things without requiring much else. He was not stupid. She could see that clearly enough. But he was the kind of man who needed to test a thing before he accepted it, and his way of testing things was not subtle. He came into the kitchen doorway on the 4th evening before supper was ready, which was itself the first test. The kitchen was her space. She'd made that clear in the quiet way she'd established it, and everyone except Dix had figured that out by observation. He leaned against the frame and watched her work for a moment. "Something you need?" she asked, not turning around. "Just looking." "The kitchen's not for looking." "Rucker says you're some kind of expert cook," he said. "That right?" Elena moved the pot. "Rucker says a lot of things, I'd imagine. He says you knew how he liked his eggs from something he said when you weren't even in the conversation." "I was in the room." Dix was quiet for a moment. She could feel him deciding something. "My mother used to make this thing," he said. "Beef and dried tomatoes stewed together. Never got the recipe." Elena was quiet for a long moment working. "Tomatoes," she said. "You'd need to ask me whether I've got dried ones in supply." "Do you?" She turned to look at him then. "I'll have a list of the full inventory by Friday. If they're on it, I'll see what I can do." He looked at her. Not the way he'd looked coming in, not the performance of looking, but actually looking, trying to figure out whether she'd just handled him or genuinely offered something. "All right," he said. He left. There were dried tomatoes in the supply store. She'd found them behind a crate of cracked corn, slightly past their best use but not beyond it, and she'd set them aside in her mental inventory along with a dozen other things that the previous cook had overlooked or not known how to use. She made a note about the stew. By the end of the first week, she had a working map of the kitchen, not on paper, in her head the way she'd always kept these things. Where everything was, what was running low, what the supply patterns looked like, which meals the men liked best and in what rotation. She knew that Rucker ate very little at breakfast, but ate heavily at the midday meal, which told her he was doing the most physical work in the morning and needed the fuel after. She knew that 2 of the younger hands, brothers named Colt and Prentice, were hopelessly competitive with each other, even over something as minor as who finished their plate first, which made her keep their portions equal to the ounce. She knew that the man with the grain problem was named Farrell, and that what bothered him was not all grains but specifically rye, which she'd figured out by process of elimination over 3 days of watching him carefully. Caleb came by the kitchen on Friday evening after the last meal had been cleared. She'd expected him sooner if she was honest. She'd been waiting, without exactly waiting, for the employer's review, the early assessment that told her whether she was actually where she'd been told she was, or whether there was a renegotiation coming. He came in without the formality of knocking, which was his kitchen as much as hers in the literal sense, and sat down at the work table in the way she'd come to recognize as his way of sitting in spaces he wasn't performing in. He didn't arrange himself for any audience. "How's the first week?" he asked. "I know the kitchen now," she said. "I've got the supply inventory done. I'll have a winter provisioning plan for you by Monday." "That's fast." "I didn't want to wait on it." "Winter doesn't wait." He nodded. He had a cup of coffee from the pot she kept going in the evenings, which she'd left out without thinking about it, just habit from running a kitchen where there were always men around who needed something warm. "The men are eating better," he said. "They're eating what they need instead of what was easiest to make," she said. "Those aren't always the same thing." "Ruckers said you figured out Farrell's grain problem." "Rye. It's not complicated if you pay attention." Caleb turned the cup in his hands. He did that when he was thinking. She'd noticed the cup, or if he was outside, a piece of rope or a piece of tack, something his hands could work while his mind did something else. "Walter Crowe came through town last week," he said. She stilled. "Harlan mentioned it when I was in for supplies on Wednesday," Caleb continued. "Said Crowe was asking questions about whether you'd signed anything before you left." Elena set down the cloth she'd been using to wipe the work table. And Arlon told him that as far as he knew, trail cooks don't generally sign contracts. "I didn't sign anything," she said. "Walter never put a contract in front of me in 3 years. That was by his design." "Contracts mean obligations running in both directions." Caleb nodded. "I assumed that was the case." He paused. "He also said something about customers. He said I took his customers." She heard the flatness in her own voice. "The freight men who come through started asking after my bread. I didn't tell them to. Some of them stopped buying Walter's dry goods because they'd started trying to get things from wherever I was. That's not theft, that's a reputation. Walter doesn't make that distinction." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "You worried about him?" She thought about it honestly. Walter Crowe was a man who liked to win arguments more than he liked to win actual outcomes, which made him unpredictable in a specific way. He was capable of doing something that cost him significantly if it also cost the other person. "He's an annoyance," she said. "He's not someone I'm afraid of." "Good." Caleb drank his coffee. "Because I don't have patience for that kind of thing." She wasn't entirely sure whether he meant he didn't have patience for Walter or for her being afraid, and she didn't ask. It didn't matter much either way. The provisioning plan she put together over the weekend was 12 pages, which she knew was more than Caleb had been expecting, because when she handed it to him on Monday morning, he looked at the thickness of it before he looked at anything on the first page. She walked him through it standing at the work table while he read. The core of the problem, as she laid it out, was that the ranch was relying on supply runs from the nearest town in a pattern that assumed the roads would be passable most of the winter, which in her experience of this kind of altitude and terrain was optimistic. She'd spent the weekend thinking through what a 6-week road closure would look like and working backward from there. 6 weeks, Caleb said. Could be shorter. Could be longer. "I've asked Rucker what the worst winter he's seen here looked like. He said 8 weeks in. 7 years ago. He told me about that winter." Caleb turned a page. "We lost some cattle. You nearly lost some men from what I can gather, from how he talks about the kitchen situation at the time." She put her finger on the relevant section. "These are the things I can put up now with what we have. If you'll give me the budget for the additional dry goods and salt. These," she moved her finger, "are what I'll need from the next supply run, which I'd recommend you move up by 2 weeks, given the weather I've seen coming off the North Ridge in the mornings." Caleb looked at the numbers for a long time. She waited. She knew the numbers were more than he'd been expecting to spend on provisioning, and she also knew they were correct, and she'd long since stopped apologizing for correct numbers, because that was its own kind of dishonesty. "All right," he said. "All of it?" "All of it." He closed the pages together. "Can I keep this? I made a copy." She indicated the other set on the shelf behind her. "That one's mine." He looked at her for a moment with the expression she was still learning to read. It was not simple. That expression, it had several things in it at once that she hadn't fully sorted. "You're very organized," he said. "Someone has to be." The supply run happened 12 days later, which was when she'd originally calculated they needed it. Because the weather from the North Ridge had come in harder than she'd wanted it to, and Caleb had moved the run up 3 days rather than the full 2 weeks she'd requested. She'd adjusted. 3 days wasn't the full buffer, but it was enough if the dry goods came back complete, which they mostly did. The merchant in town had been short on 2 things she'd specified, which she'd half anticipated and had accounted for in the secondary plan she hadn't told Caleb about, because there was always a secondary plan, and there was no point explaining the contingency structure to the person you were trying not to alarm. The dry goods went into the storage cellar in a system she'd designed over the previous 10 days, labeled in the order she'd used them so that the right things were accessible without having to move other things. Rucker helped her carry the heaviest crates without being asked, which told her he'd made his decision about her fully, and the decision was favorable. "You want these stacked low or high?" he asked, holding a crate of dried beans. "Low on the right side. I need to get to those before the ones on the left." He put it where she'd said. "How long you been doing this?" he asked. "Cooking since I was about 8. "No, the planning." He set the next crate down. "The figuring out ahead. My mother cooked and she was good, but she didn't think like that." Elena considered the question because it was actually being asked, not being used to make some other point. "When you don't have much to work with," she said slowly, "you think further ahead. You can't afford to run out of things, so you learn to see around the next corner before you get there." Rucker stood with his hands on his hips, looking at the cellar arrangement. "Makes sense," he said. He went back to the crates. Elena watched him for a moment, this quiet man who'd extended her the most essential form of acceptance, which was not approval but just simple acknowledgement, that she was here, that she knew what she was doing, that the space she occupied was hers to occupy. It was not nothing. The thing with Dix came to a head on a Tuesday 3 weeks into her time at the ranch. It wasn't about the stew which she'd made once and which had gone well enough that 3 other men had asked her what it was, which seemed to have irritated Dix rather than pleased him, as if the private connection he'd made with her through his mother's recipe had been diluted by other people liking it. She'd filed that observation away. Men like Dix needed to own things, and when the thing they thought was theirs became general, it became worthless to them. He came into the kitchen at midday when most of the other men were still out at the far pasture. "I need to talk to you," he said. "All right." He stood in the middle of the kitchen with his hat in his hand, and she could see that whatever he was going to say had cost him something already, just the getting to it. "The men are talking," he said, "about you." "What are they saying?" "That you're good." He said it like it was complicated. "Rucker told Colt that you were the best cook he'd seen on any outfit he'd worked." "Colt told his brother, who told the rest of them." Elena waited. "I said some things when you first got here," Dix said. "Not to your face, but around the bunkhouse." She kept her expression still. She'd suspected something like this. There'd been a coolness from a few of the men that hadn't quite tracked with anything she'd done, more like something they'd been told. "What did you say?" He looked at a point somewhere to the left of her shoulder. "That Thornton had made a mistake, that we'd be eating worse than the beans inside 2 weeks. He paused. "And some other things. About how you looked." Elena put down the spoon she'd been holding. She had heard variations of this her entire adult life, and she had developed responses for all of them. The cold dignity, the deliberate silence, the factual rebuke. She knew which one worked in which situation, the same way she knew which heat level was right for which dish. What she hadn't expected was for the man saying it to be standing in front of her, with his hat in his hands, telling her as himself. "Why are you telling me this?" she asked. Dix finally looked at her directly. "Because Rucker found out what I'd said, and he told me that if I was going to say that kind of thing, I should at least have the spine to say it to your face so you could—" He stopped. He used a different word. "I can guess it. And because you made the stew," he said, which was the most honest thing he'd said, she thought, and maybe the most complicated. "My mother died 4 years ago. I hadn't had that since she made it." The kitchen was quiet. Outside she could hear wind moving across the yard, and somewhere one of the horses saying something to another horse in the uncomplicated language they used. She picked up the spoon. "I'm going to keep cooking," she said. "If you've got things you eat that mean something to you, you can tell me. That's part of the job." She looked at him. "What you said in the bunkhouse I've heard worse. I'll be here whether you say it or not." Dix nodded. He looked younger than he had when he'd walked in. "Yes, ma'am," he said. He left. Elena stood in the kitchen for a moment after he'd gone, not sure what to do with what she was feeling, which was not the clean resolution she might have written if she'd been writing the scene. It was messier than that, a kind of tired recognition. The understanding that this would not be the last time, that she'd be having some version of this conversation for the rest of her life, because the world did not run out of men like Dix as fast as she ran out of patience with them. But also underneath that, something that wasn't quite gratitude but was adjacent to it. He'd told her himself. He'd used the word spine, or whatever word Rucker had used, as if the thing required was courage, which meant someone had told him that the opinion of a woman he'd dismissed required courage to face. That was Rucker's work. She'd have to not say anything to him about it, because he'd deny it and be embarrassed, and that was not how she wanted to spend the credit. Caleb found her in the storage cellar 2 days later when she was doing the mid-month inventory. She heard him on the stairs before she saw him, and recognized the particular pattern of his footsteps, which she'd learned by now the way you learn all the sounds of a place you're starting to know. He came down with a lantern and held it up slightly so she could see by it. "I heard about Dick's," he said. She tallied the row of salt containers before responding. "What did you hear?" "That he said things he shouldn't have when you arrived and went to tell you himself." "He did." Caleb set the lantern on a shelf and looked at her with the directness that she'd decided she either respected or found unsettling, depending on the day and what she'd done with the previous 8 hours. "I should have told him directly when you arrived," Caleb said, "instead of leaving it to Rucker." She looked at him. "Rucker handled it. That's not the point." He was quiet for a moment. "You're not at the trading post anymore. What happened there? Whatever Crowe let happen, that's not the standard here." Elena thought about what to say and decided the safest thing was also the truest thing. "I know that," she said. "I've seen it in how the kitchen works. I'm not carrying the trading post around with me." "Are you sure?" The question was more pointed than she'd expected, and she stood very still for a moment. She thought about the way she'd braced herself for the first week, the way she'd cataloged every unfavorable glance from the men, tracking it the same way she tracked inventory, building a case in her own mind that she knew was coming before it arrived. The way she'd told herself, alone in the cabin on the second night, that this would last as long as Thornton needed her, and then she'd be back where she started, and she might as well be ready for that. "I'm working on it," she said, which was more honest than she'd intended. Caleb picked the lantern back up. "The provisioning plan was the best I've seen," he said, changing direction without announcement. "I've had 3 foremen on this ranch. None of them thought to account for an 8-week closure. Most people don't think about the worst case until it's the case. And you?" She moved to the next row of shelves. "I grew up in a house where things ran out. You learn to think that way early." He was quiet for a moment, and she felt the question he wasn't asking, about the house, about before, and appreciated that he wasn't asking it. "Monday I'm riding the North Range to check the fenceless line before the next storm," he said. "I'll be out 3 days, maybe 4. Rucker's in charge while I'm gone. I know how to run a kitchen without supervision," she said. "I know you do." There was a pause that had something else in it. "I wasn't saying that." She looked at him. He was looking back. They'd been in this vicinity before. Not this cellar, not this conversation, but this particular proximity, the one that had a specific quality she'd been deliberately not naming. She was 37 years old, and she had not spent those years being naive, exactly, but she'd spent them in an efficient arrangement with herself where certain kinds of hope were stored in a part of the building she didn't go into, because the building would stand better without her poking at its weight-bearing walls. "I'll have extra food ready when you get back," she said. "Men who've been out in the cold for 3 days need something substantial." Caleb looked at her for one more moment. "Yes," he said, "they do." He went back up the stairs. Elena turned to the next row of inventory and wrote down numbers she'd already counted twice. He was gone 4 days. She ran the kitchen. She ran it the way she ran everything, which was not as a temporary custodian, but as the person responsible. And the difference between those two stances was something the men seemed to feel without her having to articulate it. When there were questions, she answered them. When there was a problem with one of the horses that indirectly affected the kitchen, the animal who normally pulled the water barrel had thrown a shoe on the second day. She found a workaround with Rucker that involved 2 men and an extra trip on foot, which was inconvenient but not catastrophic. On the 3rd night, a man named Jesper came to the kitchen doorway with a face that told her something was wrong before he said anything. "It's Colt," he said. "He's sick." She went to the bunkhouse. Colt was 18, Prentice's younger brother by 2 years, and he was lying on his bunk with a pallor that she recognized as real illness rather than the performed illness of a man who didn't want to work. She looked at him, asked him 3 questions, and made her assessment. "It's his stomach," she told Prentice, who was standing at the end of the bunk, with the specific tight expression of a sibling trying not to panic. "Probably something he ate outside. I've seen men pick things up on the range that don't agree with them. Keep him warm, and bring him to me in the kitchen in the morning. I'll make something that'll help settle it." "You know how to do that?" Prentice asked. "Yes." She went back to the kitchen and made a preparation she'd learned from a woman in the Eastern Valleys who'd had 7 children and dealt with stomach complaints the way a general deals with a recurring tactical problem, with a clear-eyed pragmatism and an established protocol. By the next morning, Colt was pale but sitting up, and by the afternoon he was eating plain broth, and by the time Caleb rode back on the 4th day the boy was nearly his usual self, competitive even over the small matter of who finished the broth first. Caleb came in cold and windburned from the North Range and went straight to the kitchen because that was where the warmth was. She'd already made the thing she'd promised, a thick stew with everything substantial she had, designed for men who'd been in the cold long enough to have forgotten what warm felt like from the inside. He sat down at the work table without taking his coat off first, which told her exactly how cold the North Range had been. "Colt got sick," she said, setting a bowl in front of him. "Prentice told me when I rode in. He ate. You handled it. It wasn't complicated. He just needed someone who knew what to give him." Caleb ate in silence for a moment. She went back to the stove. "Fence line's worse than I thought on the north end," he said. "We're going to have to pull 3 men from other work next week to fix it before the next storm. That'll change the meal schedule. The heavier workers will need more in the morning. I figured you'd adjust." She didn't answer that, because it wasn't really a statement that needed an answer. She was aware of him at the table behind her in the particular way she'd become aware of him over the previous weeks. Not intrusively, not uncomfortably, but with a specific noticing that she'd stopped pretending not to have. "Elena," he said. She turned. He was looking at her with the tiredness of 4 days on a winter fence line, but through it, something else. Something that had been building in the careful way things build when neither person is in a hurry, and both are watching. "The position," he said. "Is it what you expected?" She thought about what was true. "It's harder," she said, "and better." Caleb nodded slowly, like she'd confirmed something he'd been working on. "Good," he said. He ate. She turned back to the stove. The fire was doing its reliable work, and the wind was coming off the North Ridge in the way she'd started to read like a language. And somewhere in the bunkhouse, Colt and Prentice were probably arguing about something small and inconsequential, and Elena stood in her kitchen with her hands doing what her hands knew how to do, and let herself, just briefly, stop waiting for this to be taken away. It was still there. It was still hers. That was enough for tonight. The storm came in the way Elena had been watching for since the first week of December. It didn't announce itself dramatically. That was the thing about the real storms, the ones that actually caused damage. They didn't perform. They just arrived, and you either had what you needed or you didn't, and the difference between those two outcomes had been decided days or weeks before, in the quiet moments when a person was either paying attention or assuming that tomorrow would look like yesterday. She'd been watching the North Ridge every morning, since Caleb had come back from the fence line. The quality of the cold had been changing. Not colder exactly, but denser, like something was being compressed in the upper air. And the way the horses moved in the yard in the early hours had shifted in that particular edgy way animals moved when they knew something was coming that the people around them hadn't figured out yet. She'd told Rucker on a Wednesday. 3 days, she said. Maybe 4 before it hits. When it does, it won't be a regular snow. Rucker had stood in the kitchen doorway and looked at the sky the way a man looks at a sky he's been reading for 30 years, and said, "Maybe," which from Rucker was close enough to agreement. She'd gone to Caleb that evening, with a number and amount she needed from the cellar, moved into the kitchen itself, and 2 things she needed from the supply barn brought under cover immediately before the moisture got to them. She explained the reasoning in the specific way she explained things to Caleb, which was completely and without softening the parts that required his agreement, because she'd learned in the first 2 months that he didn't need things softened. He'd looked at her list and then up at the sky in the direction of the North Ridge. "How sure?" he asked. "Sure enough that I'd rather move things twice if I'm wrong than be right and have nothing to move." He'd given her what she asked for. The storm arrived on Saturday, which was 2 days later than she'd estimated, and it did not arrive gradually. Elena was up at 3:30 that morning by habit, and she knew before she opened the cabin door that the night had changed. She could hear it, not wind exactly, or not only wind, but the particular compression of sound that happened when snow was falling heavily, the way it absorbed the small noises of a yard and replaced them with a thick silence that was its own kind of alarm. She opened the door and the cold hit her like a wall, and in the lantern light she could see the snow coming down in a way that had no gaps in it, no pause, just a continuous density that told her this was not a storm you waited out in a day. She dressed and went to the kitchen. She had the stoves lit by 4 and was doing the first calculation of the day before the first man appeared for breakfast. She worked through it the way she'd worked through every version of this problem since she'd put the provisioning plan together. What they had, how long it had to last, what she could do with it that the men could eat without losing the function that kept them operational. 23 men. The kitchen had enough to feed them well for 10 days. To feed them adequately for 18. To feed them essentially not pleasantly. Not with variety, but sufficiently for 24. She hoped they wouldn't need the 3rd number. She suspected they would. Rucker was the first one in, which was always the case. The man seemed to require less sleep than anyone else on the ranch, and she'd stopped wondering about it. He looked at her face and then at the window. "How bad?" he said. "Bad enough." She handed him a cup of coffee. "The water lines are going to freeze today. I need someone on that before the men eat, not after. I'll tell Caleb, he's already up. I saw the light in the main house when I came across." Rucker drank. Outside, the snow kept coming with the indifference of something that had no agenda except its own mass. "You ready for this?" he asked. Not in the challenging way Dix would have asked it, early on. In the way of a man asking a practical question of someone he'd already decided was capable. "I was ready 2 weeks ago," she said. He nodded and went to find Caleb. The water lines froze by mid-morning, which she'd expected. What she hadn't fully accounted for was that one of the lines ran beneath the floor of the supply barn, and when it froze it expanded and cracked the fitting at the joint, which meant when they eventually thawed it, they'd have a different problem than frozen water. They'd have water going places it shouldn't. Caleb came to tell her about it around 10, with snow on his coat, and the particular look of a man who was calculating what he didn't know and didn't like the total. "We've got enough in the cistern inside the house," she said before he finished explaining. "If we're careful." "How careful?" "No washing except what's essential. Cooking water I can manage by melting snow, which we have no shortage of." She was already moving to the secondary plan, the one she hadn't fully explained to anyone, because she preferred to have the contingency ready, rather than alarming people with it prematurely. "The bigger issue is keeping the stoves fed. I need the wood situation. Rucker's on it. We've got enough stacked under cover for 3 weeks if we're not wasteful. Tell the men to not let the bunkhouse fire go completely out. Starting a cold stove costs more wood than maintaining a warm one." Caleb looked at her with something that was not quite surprise, but was adjacent to it. The recognition of someone seeing a particular kind of competence operate under pressure, which looks different than competence under ordinary conditions. "I know," he said. "I know you know. I'm saying it anyway." He almost smiled. He went back out. She went back to the stove. The first 3 days of the storm were not the worst part. The worst part was what came after, when the snow stopped and the temperature dropped to a level that turned everything that had been merely unpleasant into something genuinely dangerous. The snow that had fallen compacted and hardened, and the cold moved into it, and the world outside the walls became a specific kind of still that men who grew up in this country knew not to trust. Nobody was going anywhere. The road to town was invisible under 4 feet of drifted snow, and even if a man could find it, there was nothing on the other side of going that would help them here. This was what the provisioning plan had been built for. Elena adjusted. She had known from the beginning that 23 men eating 3 full meals a day was an assumption, not a plan. The actual plan was more like a sliding scale. She could maintain full meals as long as she had full supplies, and as supplies declined she would shift the balance, increasing the foods that created the feeling of fullness without costing her the things she needed to preserve longest. Beans, correctly prepared, could do extraordinary things. She had put up 14 pounds of dried beans in her pre-storm calculations, and she began working with them the way a musician works, with an instrument they know completely, not making them the center of every meal, which would demoralize the men faster than hunger would, but threading them through other things so they provided the foundation without being the obvious face of it. Cornbread in the mornings, bean-thickened stew for the midday meal. In the evenings, whatever she had that was most substantial. The salted pork she'd laid in, cut thin and stretched across a bed of grains, with the dried tomatoes she'd found behind the cracked corn, reconstituted in a small amount of the cooking water to give it something that tasted like life. She was using every skill her grandmother had ever shown her, and several she'd worked out herself in the particular laboratory of years of cooking in conditions that didn't offer her the luxury of waste. On the 5th day of the full lockdown, Dix came to the kitchen in the afternoon and stood in the doorway, looking at the board she'd put up near the entrance, a simple accounting of what they had, what they'd used, what she projected they'd need. She'd put it up on day 2 because she'd found that men handled scarcity better when they could see the situation clearly, that the unknown was almost always worse than the reality. Dix looked at it for a long time. "The salt pork column's going down faster than the others," he said. "Yes, is that a problem?" She turned from the stove. "It's a fact. The problem would be if I didn't know about it." She moved the pot. "I've adjusted the portions. You probably didn't notice." He hadn't. She could see that in his face. "How are we doing?" She considered how much to tell him. She decided on honest, because Dix, whatever his early failings, was someone who could handle honest and was worse off without it. "We're not comfortable," she said. "But we're not in trouble." "There's a difference." "What's the difference?" "Trouble is when you start eating things that'll hurt you. Uncomfortable is when you eat less than you want of things that won't." Dix looked at the board again. "What about another 2 weeks? If I have to manage 2 more weeks, I will." She picked up the spoon. but I'd rather not need to." He nodded and left. She went back to the stew. The thing she hadn't fully prepared for was not the food or the water or the fuel. It was the men themselves. 23 people locked in a small compound with nowhere to go, and nothing to do but wait, developed a social weather of their own. And that weather could turn the same way the actual weather outside had turned gradually. And then suddenly, with the kind of violence that nobody had seen coming, because they'd been looking at the wrong horizon. She became aware of it on the 7th day, when she noticed that the sounds from the bunkhouse in the evenings had changed. Not louder, which would have been one thing. Quieter. The specific quiet of men who'd stopped talking, because what they wanted to say was something they knew they shouldn't. Rucker came to her about it directly, which was his way. "Farrell and Jesper had words today," he said. "Nothing that went anywhere yet. But Farrell's been eating less than his share, and getting larger about it instead of smaller." She understood that. Hunger didn't always make people subdued. Sometimes it made them mean in the specific way that came from the frustration of having no target, no enemy, nothing to be angry at except the fact of the situation. "I'm going to make something tonight," she said. "Something that'll help? Something that'll feel like more than it is." She was already thinking through what she had and what she could do with it. People need something that doesn't taste like managing, even if it is. What she made that night was a version of a sweet pudding she'd learned from her grandmother dried fruit, a careful amount of molasses, grain cooked down into a texture that was warm and dense, and nothing like what they'd been eating for the past week. She had been holding the dried fruit back, rationing it, but she'd been doing the numbers, and she could afford to use the fruit tonight if she was careful with the grain tomorrow. She brought it out after the evening meal and put it on the tables without comment. The silence that came over the dining room was the good kind. Farrell ate 2 servings without looking at Jesper. Jesper ate his in the careful way of a man who was trying not to enjoy it too much in front of other people. Carlton Prentice had a brief argument about who'd had more, the first argument they'd had in 3 days, which meant they were back to normal. Caleb came to the kitchen later that night. He did this more often now, came by in the evenings when the kitchen was quiet, after the men had gone back to the bunkhouse, and the main house was too still for his purposes. She'd noticed it over the past weeks, but had not said anything about it, because saying something would require acknowledging that she'd noticed, and acknowledging that she'd noticed required her to say something about what it meant. "The pudding," he said. "It's not going to fix anything long term," she said. But they needed a night off from the reality of the situation. It worked for tonight. He sat down at the work table. She handed him coffee without him asking, which had become its own kind of habit between them. The small unconscious gestures that built up over time into something harder to name. "Rucker told me about Farrell and Jesper," he said. "Rucker tells you things. He tells me the things I need to know." Caleb looked at his cup. "He told me you were the one who noticed the weather 3 days before it hit. Rucker noticed it the same time I did. He said he noticed something. He said you knew what it meant." A pause. "He told me you were better at reading this place than anyone who'd been here longer." Elena was quiet for a moment. "The place isn't that different from other places," she said finally. "Cold is cold. The thing that's different is whether you take it seriously." Caleb looked at her in that way he had, the way that took its time. "I owe you something," he said. "The salary's fine." "Not the salary." He turned the cup, "the provisioning plan. If you hadn't pushed when you did, we'd be in real trouble right now." She thought about how to respond to that. She settled on not deflecting, because she'd spent enough years deflecting credit that she knew what it cost her, the way it built in you a habit of smallness that was hard to break. "I know," she said. It was 2 words, and she felt how much they required of her. Caleb heard it. She could tell by the way he didn't comment on them, just nodded, as if she'd said something that required acknowledgement but not analysis. "When this is over," he said, "I want to add to the position. There's a role here that's more than head cook, more like operations. Supply management, you see things coming. I need that on a ranch this size." Elena looked at him. "I'm not a foreman," she said. "No, but you're not just a cook either." She sat down across from him at the work table, which she didn't often do, and looked at her own hands on the surface. "Let's get through the storm first," she said. "Fair enough." They sat in the kitchen with the stove doing its work, and the wind running itself against the walls outside, and she thought about what it was. This thing that had been growing in the spaces between conversations, in the deliberate distance they both kept, and the way they both knew exactly where the edge of that distance was. She was not naive. She had lived long enough to know that proximity and shared difficulty created feelings that needed to be examined before they were trusted. She also knew that Caleb Thornton had seen her do her worst work and her best work over 2 months, and he hadn't adjusted his estimation of her in either direction. He'd just kept accounting for who she actually was, which was, in her experience, extremely rare. She did not say any of this. They finished their coffee and he went back to the main house, and she banked the stove and went to the cabin. and the wind kept running against the walls all night, and she slept better than she had any right to. The storm broke on the 9th day. It didn't end, it broke, which was a different thing. A shift in the pressure overhead that she felt before the snow actually stopped. That particular change in how the cold sat that told her the worst of it was past. She was up at her usual 3:30 and stepped out of the cabin and stood in the dark and breathed the air and knew. She went to the kitchen and made a full breakfast. Not managed, not stretched full. Eggs, which she'd been rationing to every other day, and the last of the good salt sliced properly, and cornbread with actual butter, because she'd kept a crock of it back specifically for this morning, the morning she'd known would come when they could all have something real without it costing the next 3 days. The men came in and she watched them understand. Rucker sat down and looked at his plate and looked at her and said nothing, because nothing was what the moment required. His silence had several registers and she'd learned them all. Dix ate everything on his plate and then looked up with the face of a man who'd just remembered what it felt like to be properly fed, which was a face that said more than he probably wanted it to. Carlton Prentice argued about the eggs within 30 seconds of sitting down, which she took as the best possible health indicator. Farrell ate quietly and steadily without the anxious speed he'd had for the past several days, and when he was done he said, "Thank you, ma'am," in the direction of the kitchen door, which she heard from the stove, and filed away. Caleb came in last and sat at his usual place at the end of the room. She brought him his plate herself, which she didn't normally do normally. She put things out, and the men served themselves, but this morning she brought it to him because it was the last of the eggs done the way he liked them, which she'd worked out weeks ago. By the same method, she'd worked out everything about the men in her kitchen. He looked up at her. "It's over," he said, "the worst of it." He looked at the plate. "You saved some back for this." "I save things back. That's what I do." He looked at her for a long moment in the morning light coming through the window, the first real light they'd had in 9 days. "Yes," he said. "You do." The work of getting the ranch back to functional after the storm was not interesting in the way that surviving the storm had been interesting. It was cold and repetitive and required the coordination of 23 tired men who had just spent 9 days confined and were not at their most collaborative. Elena stayed in her lane, which was the kitchen and everything connected to it. She managed the gradual restocking of supplies as the roads became passable, coordinating with the supply runs in the order she'd already mapped out. What was needed immediately? What could wait? What she could substitute for temporarily? The water line under the supply barn was a problem that took 4 days and 3 men and a significant amount of bad language to fix. She stayed out of that except to supply the men working on it with hot food at regular intervals, which was how she thought about her role in every problem that wasn't directly hers. Not solving it, just making sure the people solving it had what they needed to keep going. On the 3rd day after the storm broke, she was in the storage cellar doing the full post-storm inventory when she heard voices above her in the kitchen. One of them was Caleb's, the other she didn't recognize. She finished the row she was counting before going up. The man in the kitchen with Caleb was older than she'd expected from the voice, 60 at least. Heavy through the shoulders, with the bearing of someone who carried authority without needing to signal it. He was standing near the work table and he turned when she came through from the cellar, and she saw him register her in that particular way that certain kinds of men did, the brief calculation. "This is Fletcher Ames," Caleb said. "He runs the Consolidated Land and Supply out of Hartwell." Fletcher Ames extended his hand. "Miss Voss, I've been hearing about the work you did here during the lockdown." She shook his hand. "Word travels fast for 9 feet of snow. The freightmen talk." He smiled, which was a practiced smile. "I've got a proposition I was putting to Thornton. Might interest you too." She looked at Caleb. Caleb's face was doing a thing she hadn't seen it do before, which was a kind of controlled neutral that wasn't his usual expression, the absence of his usual directness. "Mr. Ames has a proposal about the ranch's supply arrangements," Caleb said. "He'd like Consolidated Land and Supply to become the primary supplier." "What's the current arrangement?" she asked, though she already knew. She'd been working with the current arrangement for 2 months. "Multiple small suppliers," Ames said, and something in his tone when he said small was instructive. "Inefficient. Vulnerable to exactly what you just went through. One consolidated supplier with a guaranteed supply line is a better arrangement. More reliable. Better pricing." Elena looked at the man carefully. She knew supply arrangements. She knew them the way she knew kitchens, which was from the inside out, from the understanding of what made them work and what made them fail. A single consolidated supplier sounded like security. It was actually the opposite. It was a single point of failure dressed in the language of efficiency. "What are the terms?" she asked. Ames looked at her as if he hadn't expected the question from her, which she noted. "Standard arrangement," he said. "Exclusive supply contract, 18 months. Pricing is locked in for the first 6, then market rate. What's the penalty for late delivery? A pause. That would be in the contract details. Is there one? Ames looked at Caleb. Caleb said nothing, which she understood he was letting her run this. She wasn't sure if that was because he'd already seen where it was going, or because he was watching to see where she would take it. Mr. Ames, she said, we just spent 9 days managing a shortage because one supply route was interrupted. You're proposing I replace 6 suppliers with one, which means instead of one route being interrupted, all of them would be. Consolidated has multiple routes, he said. Multiple routes to one warehouse or multiple warehouses? Another pause. One central warehouse, he said, in Hartwell. Hartwell is a day's ride in good weather. In a storm like the one we just had, it might as well be on the moon. She turned to Caleb. I'd want to see the contract before any discussion of terms. Ames turned a different quality of attention to her now. She'd seen this before. The shift that happened when a man who'd come into a room expecting to deal with one person discovered there was another person he had to account for. Of course, he said. These things take time to formalize. I'll look forward to reviewing it, she said. She went back to the cellar. She didn't hear what was said after she left, but she heard when Ames departed, and a few minutes later Caleb appeared at the top of the cellar stairs. He's gone, he said. I noticed. He came with a letter of introduction from 2 county officials. She looked up. Which ones? Caleb told her the names. She filed them. She'd have to find out what she could about those names and their relationship to Consolidated Land and Supply, because in her experience official introductions attached to supply contract proposals generally meant someone had already been compensated for the introduction. You want to look into them, Caleb said, don't you? Caleb was quiet for a moment. I've had 3 conversations with people in the past year who've pushed supply consolidation. This is the first time I've had someone in the room, while one of those conversations was happening, who was already asking the right questions. Elena counted the last row of grain sacks. Someone's building a position, she said. I don't know what kind yet, but you don't consolidate supply contracts across multiple ranches without a reason. That's what I thought. He paused. How do I find out what the reason is? She stood and looked at her inventory board. You'd need to know which other ranches have taken the contract, she said, and what happened to their existing suppliers after they did. Caleb descended the stairs and stood at the bottom, looking at her inventory with the focus of someone who was taking it seriously. Rucker's brother runs a spread 2 valleys over, he said slowly. He might know something. That would be a place to start. She closed the inventory book. The storage cellar was cold and smelled of grain and salt, and the particular earthiness of a space that had been doing its job correctly, holding things safe against the winter that had tried to take them. She thought about Fletcher Ames and his practiced smile and the county official names and what it might mean. And she thought about what a consolidated supply contract meant for a ranch that had just survived 9 days on her careful planning. And she understood that the storm had been one kind of emergency, and what was coming might be another kind altogether. But that was tomorrow's accounting. Tonight she had 23 men to feed, and the supply barn door was damaged from the ice and needed a fix before it let the cold in. And Colt had asked her this morning if there was any possibility of pie before the week was out, with the hopeful expression of a boy who'd grown up expecting to be told no. She told him she'd see what she could do. She took the inventory book back upstairs, and the kitchen met her the way her kitchen always did, with the particular warmth of a space that was doing its job and waiting on her to do hers. And she set the book on the shelf and went to see what was in the pie column, and whether 18-year-old Colt was going to get what he'd asked for. He was. She had enough for 1 pie, not 2, which meant she'd have to cut it carefully, and Colt and Prentice were going to have their argument about even portions, and Rucker was going to get the last slice, because he was the one who'd fixed the water line in minus 20 temperatures without complaining once, and Caleb was going to come by the kitchen in the evening, and there would be coffee and maybe a piece of pie, in the conversation they'd been having, in the spaces around other conversations. She was not afraid of any of it. She found the pie tin. She got to work. Rucker's brother was named Cole, and he ran a mid-sized cattle operation 2 valleys over called the Spur Creek Ranch. And what he knew about Fletcher Ames and Consolidated Land and Supply was enough to keep Caleb at the kitchen table for 2 full hours on a Thursday evening, while Elena stood at the stove and listened and understood that what she'd suspected in the cellar the week before was both correct and worse than she'd initially mapped. Cole had taken the consolidated contract 8 months ago. He'd taken it because the terms looked favorable and the introductory pricing was genuinely better than what he'd been paying his existing suppliers. And because the county official who'd brought Ames to his door was a man he'd known for 15 years and trusted in the particular way you trust someone who's never given you a reason not to, which Cole had told Rucker was not the same as them never having a reason. Within 4 months of signing, 2 of Cole's original suppliers had stopped operating. Not gone out of business exactly. One had sold to a buyer whose name Cole hadn't recognized. The other had simply announced he was retiring and closing, which might have been coincidence, except that the man was 52 and had told Cole the previous summer that he planned to keep running supplies for another 10 years minimum. By month 5, Cole was entirely dependent on Consolidated. The contract locked him in for another 14 months. The market rate pricing that had kicked in after the initial 6 months was 20% higher than what he'd been paying before. He couldn't prove anything. That was what he'd told Rucker. He couldn't prove the suppliers hadn't just made their own decisions. He couldn't prove the county official had been compensated. He couldn't prove that Consolidated had done anything other than offer a contract and fulfill its terms. Technically, if not always on schedule and not always completely. He was just caught, and he couldn't get out until the 18 months were done. Caleb sat at the kitchen table with his coffee going cold in front of him. "That's 3 official introductions," he said. "If Consolidated is using county officials to reach ranches, and those officials are being paid for the access, that's not a supply contract. That's a scheme. It's a scheme that works slowly," Elena said. "By the time you understand what it is, you're already inside it." How many ranches in the territory? She'd been thinking about that since the cellar. Enough that if Consolidated gets exclusive contracts across most of them, they control the supply chain for the whole region. Then the pricing isn't market rate anymore. It's whatever they decide to charge. Caleb was quiet for a long moment. She understood the weight of what they were describing. This was not a problem that lived in the kitchen or even on the ranch. This was something that would require legal knowledge, documentation, and the kind of careful assembly of evidence that she knew something about. Because feeding 23 men through a 9-day storm was, at its core, the same competency, understanding a complex system, tracking every variable, knowing which resources to protect and which to deploy and in what order. "I need to send someone to Hartwell," Caleb said. "Someone who can look at records without drawing attention." "Rucker," Elena said. He looked at her. "Rucker has a reason to be in Hartwell that has nothing to do with Consolidated, his brother's situation. He can ask questions that look like a concerned family member asking questions." She moved the pot to the cooler part of the stove. "And Rucker doesn't talk more than he needs to, which is the most important quality for that particular job." Caleb looked at her for a moment. "You've thought about this already." "I've been thinking about it since Ames left." "And you didn't say anything?" "I needed Cole's information first. No point in building a plan on an incomplete picture." He stood up and went to the window and looked out at the dark yard, the way he did when something required him to move, and there wasn't anywhere useful to move to. "There's something else," he said, and the change in his voice told her she wasn't going to like what followed. "What?" He turned around. "Walter Crowe sent a letter." She kept her expression still. "It arrived when I was on the North Range before the storm. I didn't. I should have told you sooner." He reached into his coat pocket and set a folded paper on the work table. She looked at it and then at him. "He's claiming you left owing him money," Caleb said. "A balance on supplies that he says you consumed without being deducted from your wages. He's put a figure to it." She picked up the letter and read it. The amount Walter had written was $32. He'd itemized things she'd eaten, portions of meals, coffee, flour she'd allegedly used for personal purposes. The handwriting was Walter's, which she recognized, cramped and precise in the way of a man who'd learned to write as an adult and never quite lost the deliberateness of it. It was a fabrication. Not entirely. She had eaten at the trading post. She'd been entitled to meals as part of her employment. That was standard arrangement. But Walter had taken the standard arrangement and translated it into debt, which was something only possible in a document if the reader didn't know the original terms. "He wants $32, she said. "He's also suggesting he might pursue it through the county clerk." Caleb's voice was careful, which is probably a bluff. "It's not a bluff," she said. "It's a threat designed to look like a bluff, so I'll pay it to make it go away." She set the letter down. "He's done this before. Not to me, to others. One of the freight men mentioned it once. A girl who worked for him before I came. He claimed she owed him for linens she'd allegedly ruined. She paid because she couldn't afford the alternative." "What do you want to do?" She thought about it for a moment. The easy answer was to pay, and she hated the easy answer because it was also the answer that confirmed everything Walter had ever communicated to her about her place in the world. That she owed him something, that she was in deficit by default, that the appropriate response to his aggression was to make it go away quietly. "I want to write him back," she said, "and I want to be very specific." Caleb nodded. "I can get you paper." "I have paper." She went to the shelf where she kept the kitchen ledger and records. "I also have 3 years of my own records. Wage payments received, wage deductions taken, what was deducted, and on what stated grounds." I kept them because she stopped. She hadn't thought about why she'd started keeping them so precisely, only that it had felt necessary from very early on. The instinct of a person who had learned that the official version of a story didn't always match the one she'd lived. I kept them. Caleb looked at her records, not in her hands yet, but indicated by the direction of her gesture. 3 years of records. Every dollar he paid me, every dollar he took back, every stated reason. She looked at Caleb steadily. The amounts he deducted for what he called errors or shortages. The amounts he took for what he called the biscuits that were thrown at the wall, because that was a deduction too. He counted the wasted food against my wages. The kitchen was very quiet. Elena, Caleb said, I don't need to be angry about it, she said. The records are more useful. She wrote the letter that night after the kitchen was closed. She wrote it at the work table, with the lamp turned up and the stove banked low. And she wrote it the way she did everything that required precision, which was by starting with what she knew rather than what she felt. She laid out the original terms of her employment, which had been verbal but which she could reconstruct in detail because she'd been paying attention in the way someone pays attention when they understand that the terms matter. She stated the meal allowance that was standard for domestic workers in employment situations of this kind. She stated that she had received fewer cash wages over 36 months than she was entitled to by that standard, itemizing each deduction Walter had taken and the reason he'd given. She was not threatening. She was not emotional. She was simply very, very specific. At the bottom, she wrote a single sentence that she'd thought about for 2 pages before arriving at. If you believe you have a legitimate claim, I suggest you present it to the county clerk with the documentation you have, and I will present mine. She folded the letter and sealed it. Caleb was still at the table. He'd stayed without asking if she wanted him to stay, which she'd noticed. She handed him the letter. He read it without comment until the final sentence. She said he's done this before, he said, reading her words back. He has. He'll know you can produce records he can't counter. Yes, he'll back down, probably. She sat across from him. But I want him to know why. Not just that I push back, that's all he'd learn if I paid. I want him to know exactly what I've got, and that I'm not the person he's been calculating me to be. Caleb put the letter down and looked at her with an expression she'd seen building toward something for weeks. Can I ask you something, he said. Why did you stay? 3 years at a place like that. You have these skills, this, he gestured, not able to find the word for what she had. Why that place, that long? It was a real question, and she could tell he'd been wanting to ask it for a while. She considered the answer. Because leaving requires somewhere to go, she said. And because I'd convinced myself that what I had there, the garden, the routines, my system was enough. I'd made it enough, deliberately, because the alternative was wanting more and not getting it, which is worse than not wanting. That's a way to live. It's a way to survive, she said. They're different. Caleb was quiet for a moment. When I came back through Black Hollow after the cattle drive, he said, I told myself I was going back for supplies. I know I wasn't going back for supplies. I know that too. They looked at each other across the work table in the lamplight, and Elena understood that they were at the edge of the territory they'd been circling for months. Not because either of them had been confused about where the edge was, but because walking up to the edge required being willing to see what was on the other side. I'm not good at this, Caleb said, the talking part. You're doing fine, she said. I run 8,000 acres and 23 men, and I can read weather and cattle and fencing and land, and I cannot— He stopped. I cannot read this particular situation without asking directly. She waited. Is this— He stopped again, which was the most she'd ever seen him struggle with words, and somehow it made her trust what was coming, more than if he'd said it smoothly. Is what I think is happening between us actually happening? Elena looked at her hands on the table. She'd had a version of this moment before, years ago, with a man in the eastern valleys who'd turned out to be interested in the idea of her rather than the actual work of knowing her, which was a distinction that had taken her longer than it should have to understand. She'd learned from that. She'd learned to take her time, to watch for the difference between a man who saw her and a man who saw a version of her that was convenient for him. She looked at Caleb. He had seen her fix a salt barrel. He had seen her manage a crisis without breaking stride. He had seen her write a letter to a man who'd treated her badly and remain precise about it when she could have been vindictive. He had sat in her kitchen in the evenings, not because it required anything from her, but because that was where he wanted to be. Yes, she said, it's happening. Caleb exhaled slowly. Good, he said, that's good. He didn't say anything else immediately, and she didn't require him to. They sat for a while longer, and eventually he left, and she put out the lamp and went to the cabin, and the night was cold and clear in the way it got after a storm had fully passed. And she stood outside the cabin door for a moment and looked up at the sky, which was doing something extraordinary with stars. And she thought about the letter she'd written and the records on her shelf and the man who'd just asked her a question in the kitchen, and the ranch around her that was hers to operate, and the 23 men who depended on what she did every day. And she thought, this is where I am now. Not where she'd been, where she was. Walter Crowe arrived 12 days later. She saw him from the kitchen window first, which was fitting. She'd seen the beginning of this story from the kitchen too, looking out at a trading post yard while his wagon pulled in from the route. He came alone this time, on horseback, and he was wearing his good coat, which he did when he was trying to accomplish something, not when he was passing through. She went on with the morning preparation. She heard him at the main house, heard the sounds of Caleb letting him in, the muffled conversation through walls. She concentrated on the bread she was shaping, pressing it down with the heels of her hands the way her grandmother had shown her, and she was aware that her hands were steady, which she noted because she'd expected them not to be. He'd been in the main house for about 20 minutes when she heard boots on the porch, and the kitchen door opened. She didn't turn. "I'd like a word with Miss Voss," Walter said. "You're in my kitchen, Mr. Crowe," she said, still not turning. "You can have it here or not at all." She heard him come in. She heard Caleb behind him, which meant Caleb had followed, which told her something about how the conversation in the main house had gone. She turned. Walter looked the way he always looked, the organized competence of a man who kept his appearance as a form of argument. But there was something else now, something around his eyes that was the particular look of a man who'd received her letter and understood, perhaps for the first time, that she was not the woman he'd calculated. "Your letter," he started. "What about it?" "You're making claims about your employment arrangement that are—" "I'm stating facts," she said, "with specific dates, amounts, and stated reasons. Do you have documentation that contradicts any of them?" A pause. "The nature of domestic employment doesn't always require." "The nature of your arrangement with the woman before me," she said. "The one you charged for the linens. Did she have records?" Something crossed his face. "She didn't," Elena continued. "I did. I've kept records since the 3rd week I worked for you, because by the 3rd week I understood that I needed to." Behind Walter, one of the ranch hands she hadn't heard come in Rucker was standing just inside the kitchen doorway. And then Dix, who had been moving firewood and apparently heard voices. And then 2 more, Jesper and young Colt, who'd come in for water and stopped when he saw strangers. Walter looked at the men. He took in the kitchen, the orderly shelves, the board with the inventory, the bread on the table, the evidence everywhere of a woman running a substantial operation competently. He looked at Elena. "The $32, he said. "I have a legitimate—" "You have a claim that you cannot document," she said. "And I have 3 years of records that show you owe me more than twice that figure in improperly deducted wages." She kept her voice the same temperature it had been throughout. "If you want to take this to the county clerk, I'll have my documentation in order within 2 days. I'd recommend having yours in order before you go." The kitchen was quiet. Walter's face cycled through several things. She watched them happen the way she'd learned to watch his face long ago. The frustration, the calculation, the search for a different leverage point. He found what he thought was one. "You came to this position under circumstances that some people might consider irregular," he said. "A woman of your appearance, living at a bachelor's ranch, working in a man's house, people talk." The kitchen went so still that she could hear the wind outside. She had waited for this if she was honest with herself. She had known, in the architectural knowledge she had of Walter Crowe, that he would eventually reach for this particular tool if the others didn't work. He'd used versions of it before, not on her, but she'd heard him use it on others, and she knew its shape, the suggestion that a woman's presence in a male space was somehow evidence against her, that her body was the subject of the conversation, even when the conversation was officially about something else. She took a breath. Before she could speak, Rucker said, "You're going to want to stop there." It wasn't loud. It was the specific quiet of a man who means something and doesn't need volume to communicate it. Dix took a single step forward, which didn't look like much, but which changed the geometry of the room. Walter looked at the men Rucker and Dix and Jesper and Colt and saw something in their faces that he perhaps hadn't expected. Not aggression, certainty. The particular certainty of people who'd made up their minds. "Miss Voss runs the kitchen at this ranch," Caleb said from the doorway. He hadn't moved from where he'd been standing, but something in his voice had acquired an edge she hadn't heard before. "She saved the lives and livelihoods of everyone in this room through the worst winter I've seen in 8 years. That's what her presence at this ranch means, Mr. Crowe. If you've got something else to say about it, say it clearly, so we all understand what you're suggesting." Walter said nothing. The silence lasted long enough that it became its own answer. Elena put her hands on the work table. "I'll ask you to leave now," she said. "You know where I stand on the wages matter. If you decide to pursue it, I'll be ready. If you don't, we have nothing further to discuss." Walter looked at her for one more moment, this man who had thrown her biscuits at a wall, who had docked her wages for 3 years, who had calculated her silence and her limited options, and built a system on both. And she watched him see, maybe for the first time, that the calculations had been wrong from the beginning. He left. Nobody moved for a moment after the sound of his horse leaving the yard faded. Then Colt said, in the specific tone of a boy who'd witnessed something he wasn't entirely sure he understood, "Is he coming back?" "No," Lena said. She went back to the bread. "I need the kitchen cleared. I've still got 3 more loaves to get in before noon." The men filed out. Dix went last, and he looked at her as he went in a way that said something he didn't put words to, and she acknowledged it with a nod, which was enough. Caleb was the last to leave. He stood in the doorway for a moment. "You all right?" he asked. "I'm fine." She pressed the bread down. "I was always going to be fine." "I know that," he said. "I'm asking anyway." She looked up. "I know you are." He left. She finished the bread. The information Rucker brought back from Hartwell arrived in pieces over the following week, because Rucker did not believe in dramatic revelations and delivered information the way he did everything, which was steadily and in the order it made sense. What he'd found was not complicated, but it was dense with implication. Fletcher Ames had arrived in Hartwell 14 months ago, not as a merchant but as a representative of a land company, a company called Western Territorial Holdings, which operated out of a city so far east it might as well have been a different country, and which had been quietly acquiring land and supply chain positions across several territories. Consolidated Land and Supply was the supply arm. Western Territorial Holdings was the ownership structure behind it. The scheme, as far as Rucker had been able to determine from the records he'd been able to examine, worked in a sequence: supply contracts first, then when ranches became dependent, pricing pressure, then when ranches became financially stressed, land offers at below market rates. 2 ranches in the neighboring valley had already sold. Cole's operation was not in immediate danger, but it was under the kind of pressure that had only one direction if nothing changed. Lena sat with this information at the kitchen table on a Sunday, writing it into an organized account while Caleb read over what she'd already written. She had a habit of writing things down, not because she'd forget them, but because writing forced a particular precision that her mind sometimes shortcut. "How many ranches have the supply contract?" Caleb asked. "Rucker found records for 7 confirmed," she said. "He thinks there are more but couldn't get to those files." "And how many have sold land to Western Territorial?" 2 sold. 1 more has had an offer." Caleb leaned back. "If they get enough of the supply chain and enough of the land, they can set prices for the whole territory. Beef prices, supply prices, everything. That's the idea." Elena finished a line. "The county officials are the key. They're issuing the introductions that make the contracts look legitimate. If the officials are being paid for that..."
"That's corruption."
"That's evidence of corruption," she said. "Which is different, until you can show what they received." Caleb was quiet for a moment. "You know what needs to happen," he said. "Someone needs to take this to a territorial attorney," she said. "Not a local one. The county officials would have relationships with local law." "Needs to go above that, I know a man," Caleb said. "His name is Aldridge. He handled my father's land title questions 15 years ago. He's in the territorial capital. Would he take this, if the documentation's solid?" Elena looked at what she'd written. She had the supply records from her own work, the pattern of prices, the timing, the gaps. She had Rucker's information from Hartwell. She had the letter from Ames with its terms, which she'd kept a copy of. She had Cole's account, which Rucker had written out at her request, witnessed and signed. "It needs one more thing," she said. "It needs someone to talk to the ranches that sold. Find out what they were told when the land offer came in, whether they were pressured or whether they genuinely chose to sell." "I can ride to the Marley spread," Caleb said. "They were one of the ones who sold." "I know," she looked at him. "Take Rucker. 2 witnesses are better than 1. He nodded. He stood up from the table and did the thing he'd been doing lately, which was rest his hand briefly on her shoulder as he passed, not as anything declarative, just as the quiet acknowledgement of 2 people who'd agreed to be in proximity to each other's lives. "When we get back," he said, "I want to have a real conversation." "Not around things, I know," she said. He left. She sat alone at the kitchen table with the organized account in front of her, and thought about what she'd written and what it meant. She'd been in this territory for less than a year, and she'd somehow ended up at the center of something that was going to matter for a long time after she was done with it. She thought about Walter Crowe, who had thrown her biscuits at a wall and called it quality control. She thought about Fletcher Ames, with his practiced smile and his consolidated scheme. She thought about the ranches that had sold, the people who'd been made to feel that they didn't have options. And she thought about what it was that allowed people like Walter and Ames to operate so confidently. The assumption that the people they targeted wouldn't look, wouldn't keep records, wouldn't know how to do anything with what they found. She understood that assumption. She'd been its subject most of her adult life. She gathered the papers into order and put them in the ledger, and put the ledger on the shelf where it lived. And she went back to the stove, and she started the afternoon meal, because the men would be in from the range in 2 hours and they'd be cold and hungry, and that was her job, and she was very good at her job. And the two things, the documents on the shelf and the meal on the stove, were not contradictions. They were just both hers. Caleb and Rucker were gone 3 days. They came back with the information she'd needed from the Marley family. The story of how the sale had happened was a familiar shape-creasing pressure through Consolidated. A difficult winter, a land offer that appeared when they were most vulnerable, numbers that seemed reasonable only because they'd been made desperate first. Mrs. Marley had also provided something unexpected, a letter she'd received before the sale from Ames, in which he described the land offer as a fair market transaction. Elena read it 3 times. He put it in writing that the offer was fair market value, she said. Yes, Caleb said. But Rucker has the county records showing the assessed value at the time of sale. The offer was 40% below assessed value. Elena looked at both documents side by side. He's lying in a letter. That's not careful. He thought the Marleys weren't going to do anything with it, Rucker said. People don't generally keep letters from men who weren't bothering them anymore. Mrs. Marley kept everything, Caleb said. She told me she had a feeling. Elena understood that. The feeling that things needed to be preserved because you might need them later. The feeling that the version of events you were living might one day be disputed, and you'd need something real to hold against the dispute. She'd been living by that feeling for 3 years in a trading post kitchen. She wrote the covering letter to Aldridge the attorney that evening, attaching the account she'd compiled and the documents they'd assembled. Caleb read it and signed it. Rucker signed as a witness. She sent it with the next freight rider heading toward the territorial capital. Then she went back to the kitchen. She made biscuits. Not because it was ironic and not because she was making a point, but because the bread needed to be made. And making it was what her hands knew to do when the larger things were in motion and out of her hands. And the particular specific work of flour and lard and cold water and fire was the thing that had always brought her back to what was real. Dix came into the kitchen in the late afternoon and watched her work for a moment. Rucker says you wrote up the whole thing, he said. The supply scheme. Rucker says a lot of things. He says you're the one who caught it. Elena shaped the biscuits. Fletcher Ames caught himself, she said. He told the Marleys in writing that he was offering fair market value for land. He was offering 40% below assessed price. All I did was put the papers next to each other. Dix leaned against the doorframe. That's still something. It's reading, she said, and arithmetic. He was quiet for a moment. Then, you know what none of us thought when you first got here? She waited. That you'd be the one to... He stopped, and she could see him trying to find a word that wasn't the wrong one. I don't know how to say it without it sounding like I'm surprised, which I know I don't have the right to be. You'd have been surprised by anyone, she said. It just happens to be me. He thought about that. Yeah, he said. I guess that's right, he left. She put the biscuits in. The evening came down over the ranch the way evenings came gradually, and then all at once the light pulling back from the yard, and the cold moving in to replace it, and the sounds of men finishing work and making their way toward warmth and food, and the kitchen filling with the smell of what she'd made, and Elena, standing at the center of it all in the particular way she'd stood, at the center of kitchens her whole life, except that this time the center felt like something she'd chosen rather than something she'd been left in. Caleb came in for the evening meal and sat at his usual place and ate, and after the other men had gone he stayed, which he did. Aldridge will have the letter by Friday, he said. I know. Whatever happens with it, whatever he can do or can't do, you should know that what you put together is more than anyone else would have caught. She looked at him across the table. Stop, she said, not unkindly. He stopped. I know what I did, she said. I don't need it catalogued. He nodded slowly. Fair enough. She poured coffee for both of them and sat down. You said you wanted to have a real conversation, she said. When you got back, I did. You're back. Caleb put both hands around his cup and looked at her with the directness she'd come to rely on, the quality she trusted most in him, the fact that when he looked at her, he was looking at her and not at some version of her that was easier to deal with. I'd like you to stay, he said. Not just as head cook. As he stopped, picked it up again. I'm not good with speeches. I know what I want. I want you at this table in the mornings. I want you running this operation with me, not for me. He paused. I want to not be doing this alone. Elena looked at her coffee. She'd been waiting, she realized, for the part where it went wrong. The qualification, the condition, the thing that would reveal the version of this that was actually available to her rather than the version she'd been allowing herself to consider. She'd been holding space for the disappointment the way she held space for bad weather. Because bad weather came, and the question was whether you were ready for it. She looked up. He was still there, looking at her with the same expression, waiting without pressure. I'm not easy to know, she said. I know that. I have opinions about supply chains and storm preparation and kitchen organization that I will share without being asked. I've noticed. And I've spent a long time building a life that I can carry by myself, she said, and I'm not sure how to put that down. You don't have to put it down, Caleb said. I'm not asking you to carry less. I'm asking whether you want to stop carrying it alone. The kitchen was quiet around them. Elena thought about the cabin with the lock on the door, and the window that looked over the yard, and the mornings at 3:30 when the stoves needed lighting, and the whole ranch was asleep, and the work was hers and hers alone. She thought about what it had taken to build a life she could carry, and how much it had cost, and how much she'd learned to call the cost reasonable. She thought about Biscuits thrown at a wall. She thought about the North Ridge and the storm, and 23 men fed through 9 days, because she'd paid attention and kept records, and didn't let herself be talked out of what she knew. She thought about flour and lard and cold water, and the particular alchemy of things that put together right, made something that stopped a man in a corner and made him look. Yes, she said. Caleb breathed. All right, he said. They finished their coffee. The night held the ranch in the particular quiet of a cold, clear February, and somewhere in the yard the horses were doing their slow nighttime breathing, and in the bunkhouse the men were settling into sleep, and Elena sat at the kitchen table across from Caleb Thornton, with the organized ledger on the shelf and the cleaned stove and the documented records of everything that had happened and was about to happen, and she understood that she'd arrived somewhere she hadn't known she was heading until she was nearly there, which was the truest way she'd ever arrived anywhere worth going. The letter from Aldridge came on a Tuesday in early March, when the snow was still heavy on the ground, but the air had changed in the particular way that meant the season was considering a different direction. Elena was in the kitchen when Caleb brought it in. She knew from the way he held it that it was significant, not by any dramatic signal, just by the careful way he set it on the work table before he sat down, the deliberateness of a man who understood that some pieces of paper required a moment before you opened them. She wiped her hands and sat across from him. He opened it and read it without speaking. She watched his face, which she'd become good at reading over the months, not performing anything, just actually reading, the small shifts that happen when information landed and was being sorted. He finished and looked up. Aldridge is taking it, he said. He says the documentation is sufficient to open a territorial investigation into Western Territorial Holdings and Consolidated Land and Supply. He's also forwarding the information about the county officials to the Territorial Marshal's office. Elena was quiet for a moment. How long? She asked. He says the investigation could take months. He says the important thing right now is to make sure the ranches with existing contracts know what they signed and what their options are for challenging the exclusivity terms if Consolidated breached any delivery obligations. She thought about coal. She thought about the other ranches Rucker had identified. She thought about the Marley family and the letter with the false market value claim sitting in the assembled documentation she'd sent east. Coal's contract, she said. Aldridge says the pricing terms may be challengeable if we can show the original suppliers were pressured out of operation rather than closing independently. Caleb set the letter down. That's harder to prove, but possible. Aldridge says possible. She stood and went back to the stove, not because anything needed her at that moment, but because she thought better in motion, with her hands doing something. She moved the pot. She checked the bread. She stood at the stove with her back to Caleb and thought through the shape of what was happening. This was not going to be clean. She'd known that from the beginning. Investigations of this kind moved slowly, and the people being investigated had resources to slow them further, and the ranches that had already sold their land were not going to get it back through any process that existed. Justice, in her experience, was not a complete reversal of damage. It was more like a stop-a-point where the damage ceased to accumulate, where the pattern was broken, where the next person in line didn't have to go through what the last person had. That had to be enough. She'd made her peace with it being enough before she'd sent the letter. I want to tell Cole myself, Rucker said from the doorway. She hadn't heard him come in, but Rucker moved through spaces without announcing himself, which she'd long since stopped being startled by. He'd clearly heard enough to understand. He should hear it from family. Take the letter, Caleb said. He should see it. Rucker nodded and came in, and Caleb handed him the letter. And Elena watched the big quiet man fold it into his coat pocket with the care of someone handling something that mattered, and then he left to saddle his horse. The kitchen settled back into its usual sounds. The fire, the pot, the wind outside doing what March wind did in this country, which was argue with everything it touched. There's something else, Caleb said. She turned. He had a second piece of paper in his hand, not from the envelope with the letter. This one was folded differently, smaller, and he held it in a way that told her it was older than today. Walter Crowe withdrew his claim 2 weeks ago, he said. I didn't say anything because I wanted to wait until we heard from Aldridge. I didn't want the two things mixed together. She looked at him. The county clerk sent a notice, Caleb continued. No reason given. The claim was simply withdrawn. Elena thought about the letter she'd written, the records on her shelf, the specific precision of itemized deductions and dates and stated reasons, assembled by a woman who'd known from the 3rd week of her employment that she would need them someday. He found out I had documentation, she said, most likely. She turned back to the stove. She waited for something satisfaction, maybe, or the particular release that was supposed to come when a thing you'd been braced against stopped pressing. She found something quieter than that, not nothing, but quieter. The withdrawal of Walter's claim was not justice any more than his original claim had been injustice. They were both just paper. Just the surface layer of something that had happened in the actual physical reality of a kitchen where biscuits had been thrown at a wall and wages had been docked for 3 years while a woman kept her records and waited. The records had been worth keeping. That was what she took from it. Elena, Caleb said. She turned again. He was standing now, and he had the look of a man who had planned to say something and was trying to decide whether this was the right moment. She'd seen that expression on him before, and she'd learned that the right response was to simply wait, because Caleb Thornton would arrive at the thing he meant to say if she didn't rush him. I'd like to marry you, he said, if you're willing. She looked at him for a long moment. Outside, Rucker's horse moved out of the yard at a steady walk. Inside, the bread was doing exactly what it was supposed to do. The fire was doing its reliable work. The inventory on the shelf was current within 2 days, which was as current as it needed to be. You'd better mean that, she said. I mean everything I say, he said, which she knew was true. It was one of the least complicated things about him. Then yes, she said, I'm willing. He crossed the kitchen and she turned fully toward him, and he took both her hands in his, which were cold from having been outside, and warm from the coffee, and rough from the years of work they'd done, and she thought that was about right. For hands, for people, for the way things actually were, rather than the way anyone imagined them. I don't have a ring, he said. I noticed, she said. That's fine. He held her hands for a moment. I'll get one, he said. Take your time, she said. We're not going anywhere. Spring came the way it always did in that country, reluctantly, in stages, with cold stubbornness right up until the moment it gave way, and then it gave way completely, and the ground appeared from under the snow, like something being revealed rather than simply uncovered. Elena stood at the kitchen window. On the first morning she could see bare ground in the side yard, and thought about the garden she was going to plant. She had plans for it. Serious plans, the kind she'd been refining in the back of her mind since the first week at the ranch, when she'd looked at the south-facing slope below the storage barn, and understood what grew there, and what didn't and why, and what would grow there with some attention. She'd written the plans in the kitchen ledger, because that was where she wrote things she meant to act on, and by now the ledger had 3 pages of garden specifications that Caleb had read once and handed back without comment, which was his way of saying he was on board. The investigation into Western Territorial Holdings was moving through the territorial legal system with the speeds of such things, which was not fast. Aldridge sent updates every few weeks, and Elena read each one and added it to the file she kept and tracked the progress the way she tracked supply levels. Not anxiously, just accurately, because accuracy was the tool she had, and she used the tools she had. 2 of the county officials had already been questioned. One of them had retained a lawyer, which Aldridge wrote about in measured language that Elena translated as significant. Fletcher Ames had not been seen in the territory since March, which might have meant he was elsewhere on business, and might have meant something else. Cole's contract was being reviewed by a different attorney Aldridge had recommended, someone who specialized in supply agreements and had found what he described as potential irregularities in the exclusivity clause. Cole had written Rucker a letter that Rucker had read in the kitchen and then folded and put in his shirt pocket and not mentioned again, which Elena respected. The world was not fixed, but it was different than it had been. The wedding happened in May, on a Saturday, in the yard of the ranch, when the weather had made up its mind about being spring and decided to be it properly. Elena had not planned a large event because that was not who she was, and Caleb had not pushed for one because he understood that. What they had was the 23 men of the ranch, several neighboring families who'd been coming by more frequently since word had spread about the investigation, about the winter, about the woman who'd run the kitchen through the worst storm in 8 years, and a circuit judge named Hollis, who Caleb had ridden 3 hours to find, and who performed the ceremony with the efficient warmth of a man who'd done many weddings in many yards across the territory and understood that what made them matter was not the ceremony but the people. Elena wore the dress she'd made from fabric, Caleb had brought back from town without being asked, which was a deep green that she'd chosen herself from the samples he'd brought. It fit her the way things fit her, which was the way she was built, and she wore it without apology, because she'd run out of apologies for her body a long time ago, and she didn't miss them. Rucker stood at Caleb's side. Dick stood just behind Rucker, and Elena saw in Dick's face something she hadn't expected, which was genuine feeling. Not performed, not sentimental exactly, but real. The face of a young man who'd watched something happen over months and understood that he'd nearly missed it by being the person he'd been when she'd arrived. Mrs. Marley from the sold ranch had come, which surprised Elena until she thought about it, and then it didn't. The woman had driven 2 hours in a wagon by herself and brought a jar of preserved fruit and sat in the front row with the specific bearing of someone who needed to see something good happen. Judge Hollis said the necessary words. Caleb said I wills in the direct way he said everything, and Elena said I wills in the same tone she used when she confirmed an inventory order, which was not unfeeling. It was the tone of someone who means what they say without needing to perform the meaning. He put the ring on her finger. He'd gotten it from a jeweler in Hartwell, a plain silver band with no ornamentation, which was exactly right. Rucker shook Caleb's hand. Dix looked at his boots. Colt and Prentice argued briefly about something in the back row. Farrell stood very still with a face that was doing several things privately. Mrs. Marley pressed Elena's hand and said, "You're a good woman," and Elena said, "Thank you for coming," and they understood each other. The meal afterward was the best Elena had ever produced at the ranch, which was saying something given what she'd done through a 9-day storm on depleted supplies. She'd been planning it for 2 months, and she'd used everything she had available to her, and she'd fed 40 people with the particular satisfaction of someone who understood that feeding people well was a form of care, and care was not a small thing. It was, if she was honest, and she was always honest, even when it cost her the most important thing she knew how to do. The garden came in that summer with the stubbornness of things that had been properly prepared for. She turned this in the soil in April when the ground was just soft enough and too wet in most places, and exactly right in the spots she'd identified the previous fall. And she'd planted in the order she'd planned. And now in July she stood in it in the early morning before the kitchen work started and looked at what was growing. It was not a perfect garden. The west end had too much shade from the storage barn, and she'd lost her first planting of beans there and replanted with something more tolerant, which had worked but not as well as she'd wanted. The tomatoes were doing well. The herbs she'd planted along the south edge were doing very well, and she'd started drying them in the kitchen in small bundles that gave the room a particular smell that the men had stopped noticing, because it was the smell of the kitchen now, which meant it had become home. Caleb came out to find her on a morning in late July. He did this sometimes came to find her wherever she was, rather than waiting for her to come in, which was not something she'd expected from him, but had become one of the things she valued. He handed her a cup of coffee and stood beside her, looking at the garden. "Tomatoes are coming," he said. "Another 2 weeks. The beans? The west end's behind. The rest are close." She sipped the coffee. "How are the cattle numbers looking?" "Good year so far." He stood beside her with the ease of someone who'd learned to occupy the same space without quite requiring anything from it. Aldridge wrote again. She waited. "The 2 county officials have entered into agreements with the territorial prosecutor. In exchange for cooperation, they're providing documentation of the payments they receive from Western Territorial Holdings." He paused. "Ames has been located. He's in another territory, but the warrant is territorial, so they'll bring him back." "Aldridge thinks so, eventually." She thought about eventually. Eventually was the speed of this kind of justice, not satisfying in its timing but real in its outcome, if the documentation held, and the cooperation held, and the legal process did what it was designed to do. "The Marley land," she said. "Aldridge says there's a question about whether the sale can be voided given the fraudulent valuation claim in the letter. It's not certain, but it's being looked at." Elena thought about Mrs. Marley in the front row at the wedding with her jar of preserved fruit. She thought about what it would mean to that woman if the land came back, and what it would mean if it didn't. She'd thought about it often, actually, how the difference between those two outcomes wasn't just legal or financial, but the difference between a person believing that what had been taken from them could be restored, and a person learning to live with the knowledge that it couldn't. Both required a kind of strength. They were just different kinds. "I hope it goes right for her," Elena said. "So do I." They stood in the garden in the early light with the coffee going warm between their hands, and somewhere in the ranch yard the day was starting boots on ground. Horses, the sounds of men who'd woken to another day of work on land they understood, and Elena looked at her tomatoes and her herbs and the West End beans that were behind but not finished, and she thought about what had brought her here. Not the decisions exactly. The decisions were the surface of it. What had brought her here was something underneath the decisions, the accumulation of every morning she'd gotten up at 3:30 and lit a stove in a place that didn't value her, and kept her records anyway, and kept the salt barrel and the biscuits and the system running anyway. Not because she'd been waiting for something or building toward something, but because doing her work correctly was the only claim to herself she'd had that nobody could take. That was the thing she'd understood, slowly, over the years. And more clearly now, the woman who'd kept records in a trading post kitchen hadn't been keeping records for Walter Crowe. She'd been keeping them for herself. The garden she'd planted in the frozen side yard of the trading post hadn't been for Walter's benefit. It had been hers, the knowledge in her hands, the flour and lard and cold water, the altitude and the limestone water in the fire. That had been hers from the beginning, and nobody throwing biscuits at a wall could change what she knew. You couldn't take competence from a person. You could ignore it, you could fail to pay for it, you could throw it across a room in a fit of manufactured displeasure, but the competence stayed in the person. It went with them wherever they went. She'd taken hers to a ranch in the mountains and used it to keep 23 men alive through a storm and expose a territorial supply scheme and plant a garden with herbs along the south edge that made the kitchen smell like somewhere worth being. That was enough. That was, if she was honest, a great deal. "I should start breakfast," she said. "In a minute," Caleb said. She looked at him. He was watching the tomatoes with the expression of a man who was not thinking about tomatoes, which she'd learned to read, and she waited. "I want to say something," he said. "All right. I know you didn't need me to find this. Any of this," he gestured, "at the ranch, at the garden, at the general direction of their life. You were doing fine, I was surviving," she said, which was the distinction she'd made to him before. "Right." He turned to look at her. "I want you to know I understand the difference. What you had there wasn't nothing. You built something real in a bad place, and giving it up to come here was a risk." She thought about the garden in the frozen side yard, the system, the records on the shelf, the salt barrel. "It was," she said, "and I'm aware that asking you to put that down." "Caleb," she looked at him, "I didn't put it down. I carried it here." He looked at her for a moment. "Everything I built there, I built here better," she said. "The garden's bigger. The kitchen's better supplied. The records are more complete." She turned back to the tomatoes. "You didn't rescue me from what I had. You gave me somewhere to put more of it." He was quiet for a long time. "That's better than what I was trying to say," he said. "I know," she said. "You're not good with speeches." "No, I don't need speeches." "No," he agreed. "You need good storage conditions and a south-facing slope for the herbs." She almost smiled, which was what he'd been angling for, she thought. "Go find Rucker," she said. "The north fence still has that post that needs resetting before the ground gets too hard again." He handed her his empty cup and went. In the years that followed, the ranch grew in the steady way that things grow when they're properly tended, not in sudden leaps but in increments that were hard to see until you looked back over a significant distance and understood how far you'd come. The investigation concluded 18 months after Aldridge's first letter. Western Territorial Holdings was found to have engaged in fraudulent supply practices across 9 ranches in the territory. Fletcher Ames was tried and convicted on 2 counts of commercial fraud and 1 count of corruption of public officials. The county officials who'd cooperated with the prosecution received lesser charges and fines. The 2 officials who hadn't cooperated faced the same charges without the benefit of leniency. The Marley land sale was voided. That took longer 2.5 years from the time the investigation began, and it was not clean or simple, and Mrs. Marley spent a portion of that time in a state of suspended uncertainty that Elena thought about more than she mentioned. But the land came back. The fraudulent valuation letter had been specific enough and damning enough that the territorial court found the sale legally invalid. Mrs. Marley came to the ranch the week after the judgment. She sat in Elena's kitchen and drank coffee and didn't say much, and Elena didn't require her to. She put biscuits on the table and sat across from her, and they sat together in the kitchen with the herbs hanging in their bundles and the inventory on the shelf and the sound of men working in the yard outside. And eventually Mrs. Marley said, "I didn't think it would actually happen." "I wasn't sure either," Elena said. "How did you keep going when you weren't sure?" Elena thought about it honestly. "I kept doing the work in front of me," she said. "The part I could actually do, the documentation, the letter, the organizing of what we had into something that made sense." She set her cup down. "You can't control how a thing ends. You can control whether you kept the records." Mrs. Marley looked at her for a long moment. "You're a different kind of person than I expected," she said. "What did you expect?" "I don't know. Someone fiercer, maybe." Elena considered that. "I've never found fierceness very useful," she said. "It takes too much energy and people just get defensive. Specificity is harder to argue with." Cole's operation recovered once the consolidated contract was declared void due to the pricing irregularities his attorney had identified. It took him a year to rebuild his original supplier relationships, and some of them couldn't be rebuilt because the suppliers had genuinely moved on, and he had to find new ones, which was its own kind of work. But he managed it. Rucker rode out to see him twice that year, and came back both times with the particular quietness of a man who'd seen his family doing better. Dix left the ranch in the third year, not on bad terms, but because he'd been offered a position running his own small operation to the south, and he came to Elena before he left with his hat in his hands, in the same way he'd come to her years earlier in the kitchen. And he said, "I want you to know I understand now what I was like when you got here." "I know you do," she said. "I'm sorry for it." She looked at him. This young man who'd grown into something more considered than he'd started as. "You went and told me yourself," she said, at the time. "That's not nothing." He nodded. He shook Caleb's hand and Rucker's hand and got on his horse, and Carlton Prentice watched him go from the fence with the competitive attentiveness they brought to everything. The garden expanded every year. She added a second plot on the eastern side of the kitchen building when she realized she'd outgrown the first, and she developed a system for preserving the summer's excess that had become something several neighboring ranches asked about, coming to her in the fall with questions and leaving with more information than they'd expected. She didn't charge for the information. She'd been given information freely when she needed it. The trapper who'd taught her about preserving in the eastern valleys, the woman whose stomach remedy she'd used for Colt, and she understood that knowledge moved through people the way water moved through land, finding channels, doing work. She became known in the region for her bread. She knew this because people mentioned it when they came through, and because one summer, a family passing through on their way further west stopped at the ranch for supplies, and the woman, young, with 2 children, looking the way people looked when they'd been on the road for weeks and were more tired than they were showing, had eaten a biscuit and put her hand over her mouth for a moment. Elena watched this from the kitchen doorway. The woman looked up and saw her and said, "I haven't tasted anything like this in months." "Sit down," Elena said. "I'll get you more." She fed them a proper meal and sent them on with a wrapped package of bread for the road. The husband tried to pay for more than the supplies. Elena charged him for the supplies and not for the bread, which he didn't understand until he looked at her face and understood that this was not a negotiation. She stood at the kitchen window and watched their wagon move down the road until it curved around the ridge and disappeared, and she thought about what it meant to feed someone who was tired, what it actually meant, not as a transaction but as a human act, the decision to take what you knew how to do and turn it in the direction of someone who needed it. Her weight had not changed significantly over the years. She was still large, still moved with the deliberate efficiency she'd always had, still occupied space in a way that some had opinions about, and most people, with time and proximity, stopped having opinions about because opinions about her body ran up against the fact of her and tended to lose. She had stopped, somewhere in the middle of the second year at the ranch, looking for the things she'd been braced against. The moment when someone would find the flaw in the situation, when the calculation she'd been made to believe about herself would be confirmed. She'd stopped looking for it, not because she'd decided to trust the world, which would have been naive, but because she'd understood that the calculation had been wrong. Not wrong in a way that required anyone to officially correct it. Just wrong, in the same way that Walter Crowe's claim had been wrong probable, specifically with documentation, by someone who'd been paying attention. She was worth what she was worth. She'd always known what she knew. The only thing that had changed was that she now lived in a place that accounted for it accurately. Caleb was not a demonstrative man, and she was not a demonstrative woman, and they had built, between those two facts, a life that expressed itself in the practical register in decisions made together, in problems solved together, in the steady shared occupation of a ranch that was doing well by the measure of things that mattered. He asked her opinion on things outside the kitchen, and she gave it. And sometimes he took it, and sometimes he didn't, and they had, over the years, a few arguments that were real arguments, not performances, and they came through each one with a better understanding of where the other person's edges were. She had not become easy to live with. She knew this. She was organized in a way that could feel like control, and specific in a way that could feel like criticism, and she had opinions about the supply arrangements and the fence line, scheduling, and the way the hay was stacked in the barn that she occasionally kept to herself and occasionally did not. Caleb had not become easy to live with either. He was quiet in ways that required patience to sit with, and he made decisions sometimes without enough consultation, and he had a stubbornness about certain things. The north pasture rotation, the timing of the cattle drive, that she thought of as the particular stubbornness of a man who'd been right so many times that he'd stopped checking whether he was right. They were, in the accounting she ran privately, suited to each other in the specific way that two imperfect systems can be suited, not by being compatible but by being honest about where they weren't and managing it. That was marriage, she thought. Not the ceremony in the yard or the plain silver ring or the words the judge said. The managing of the honest incompatibilities between two real people who decided to be in the same place. It was harder than the storm. It was better than anything she'd had before. On a morning in the 5th year, she was in the garden in the early light with coffee in her hand when Rucker appeared at the fence line. He did this sometimes, came to the garden in the morning and stood at the fence with the ease of a man who'd learned the comfortable distances between people over a long working life and had sorted where he fit in this one. "Colt's getting married," he said. She turned. "When did this happen?" "He told me this morning. Girl from the Henderson spread. He's been riding over there on his days off for 6 months apparently." Elena thought about Colt, the 18-year-old who'd eaten 4 biscuits his first night and argued with his brother about portion sizes. He was 23 now, and the boy had become a young man with a good portion of Rucker's quietness and a small portion of Rucker's wisdom, which was about right for 23. "He's going to want a celebration meal," she said. "He asked me to ask you." Rucker looked at the fence post. He was scared to ask directly. "I know." She looked at her tomatoes, which were a good year this year. "Tell him yes. And tell him to bring her here first before the wedding, so I can feed her a proper meal and see what kind of person she is." Rucker looked at her. "Not to judge her," Elena said, "because anyone marrying into this outfit deserves to know what they're getting into, and a meal is the fastest way to find out whether a place is home." Rucker was quiet for a moment. "That's a good way to think about it," he said. "It's the only way I know." He went back to the yard. She stood in the garden with her coffee, and the morning light coming over the eastern ridge, and the smell of herbs and turned earth, and the particular clear air of a spring morning in that high country. She thought about the girl she'd been in a trading post kitchen, keeping records by lamplight, planting a garden in frozen ground that no one would tend after she left. She thought about what she'd understood then, without fully having the words for it, which was that the work you do honestly doesn't disappear when you leave a place. It follows you. It becomes the thing you do at the next place and the next, and it compounds. Not in a way anyone can see from the outside, not in a way that announces itself, but in the quality of what you produce and the precision with which you produce it, and the fact that when an emergency comes, you have what you need because you've been paying attention the whole time. She had been paying attention her whole life. That was the only extraordinary thing about her, and it wasn't extraordinary at all. It was available to anyone who decided to do it. The difference was that most people stopped paying attention when the situation didn't reward it, when the person watching over them didn't notice, when the only return on the investment was the knowledge itself. She had never stopped. She didn't think of herself as remarkable for it. She thought of herself as practical. But she understood now, in the accumulated understanding of years, that there was something the world communicated to people who looked like her, large, female, unglamorous, doing unglamorous work in unglamorous places, which was that their attention was not worth very much, that the details they noticed were not the details that mattered, that the knowledge in their hands was not the kind of knowledge anyone needed to account for. The world had been wrong about that, specifically and provably with documentation. She finished her coffee. The kitchen was waiting. 20-some men would be in from the range in 2 hours, and Colt's wedding was going to need planning, and the tomatoes needed checking, and Caleb would be looking for the supply ledger she'd updated last night, and she had a second batch of bread to shape before the day got too far ahead of her. She went inside. She lit the stove. She started the bread. The fire did its reliable work. And Elena Voss, Elena Thornton now, though she used both names depending on who was asking and what stood in her kitchen in the high country on a spring morning, and did what she had always done, which was take what she knew and turn it toward what was needed, and let that be enough, because it always had been. And the only thing that had ever needed to change was her willingness to believe it.